Candace in real life.
Yeah.
Yay!
Hey, she's here. She wows us with her data.
All right, I have 6 o'clock. I will call the meeting to order. Roll call. Larry?
Here.
Brian?
Here.
Jane?
Here.
Jeannie?
Here.
And then we have our student reps, Musab?
Here.
Dylan?
Here.
All right, we're just missing Bren. Notice of meeting?
Meeting was properly noticed.
Adoption of agenda?
So moved.
Move to adopt the agenda.
Second.
All in favor of adopting the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Do we have any comments from citizens, Julie? I do not have any. Okay. Then we will move on to salutes and recognitions. Board members, does anybody have anything? No? Admin?
Yeah, I have a couple. Today was our first professional development day of the year, which went very well from what I could observe getting around the district today. So I'd like to acknowledge Danielle and Robin Wilson and our principals and APs for all the work that they did putting today together. There's a lot of people who take a big role. Teachers do sessions, learning coaches play a really important role as well. But these are important days for our staff so that we can kind of continue to move forward with best practices. So, and again, I want to thank the board for the support of the flexibility we're showing staff this year with those days. So that was a good day.
Good. Danielle, do you have anything?
I don't have anything.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the consent agenda, we need to accept the minutes from our last meetings on October 10th. There was some correspondence in our packet, and there were no gifts. So do I have a motion to accept the consent agenda?
I move to accept the consent agenda.
Second.
All in favor of accepting the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. And we will move on to the super fun part of our evening. Candace, are you ready?
Time for data.
Time for some data, yeah.
So as Candace is coming up, I'll just do a little introduction here. So one, we're excited to have Candace in person with us for this. So it's great to have her back. Becky Cook is with us tonight as well. If you recall, Becky moved into essentially Candace's position, and we elevated Candace to our Director of Data and Assessment. So Becky has been helping out with all of this as well, and she's here to learn too about this process. You got my CIR in the packet and stuff, so I'm going to be interjecting along the way so as to not sort of double up and say things twice, as sometimes happens when I do that all together separate from Candace's report. But Candace is here to help walk us through the annual report, and just one noted item is that our state report cards have not been unembargoed yet. We have seen them internally, but we cannot speak about them until they are not embargoed any longer, which is we believe to be November 15th. So once those get released, I'll send you a memo with the details on that and a summary. But normally tonight is a night where we also talk about those, but we don't have those yet to be able to publicly talk about. So I just want to note that is a piece that we won't be talking about tonight. I'll turn it over to Candace.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started with the annual assessment report. As usual, if you have any questions while we're going through it, please feel free to do a shout out, wave your hands, just start talking, and I'd be happy to answer any of those that you have. So as Danielle noted, I'm Candace. I'm here in person and here to talk. The first slide is really just about district enrollment. Enrollment did increase in 21-22. However, it continued to result in about 84 less students from the past 5 years, and that's really just from the decrease in 2021. We can see fairly pointedly where that happens on the overall summary slide. This is most pronounced in PLE, about 40 to 50 students after accounting for that grade level change that happened there. And then Horizon, the high school, 60 students. Horizon was about 22, but not as bad as the other two. 2023 is projected to be about 40 students higher, so really starting to eat into that drop as we were going up. Looking at our race demographics, the largest gains in minority populations were from 2011 to 2015. That's something we've seen before since that was a few years ago. We've had small changes every year since 2015, and this year we did experience a slight decrease down to just under 20%. We were hovering right above 20%. Students identifying as Asian are the largest at 6.9%, and students identifying as two or more races are at 5.6%. So those are the two largest groups of minority populations. As we can see here, this is just kind of the raw numbers to take a look at. In terms of total number, we're still definitely seeing an increase, a little more than double since 2008. However, similar to the larger population that we saw take that dip, the sheer number of students of minority populations also decreased, and it decreased at the same time in 2021. When we look at our English language learners overall, and since 2008, really seeing a pronounced increase from 36 to 50 students. We have seen a slight decrease in the last 3 years. That probably aligns well with the decrease in minority students that we're seeing a little as well. In terms of our economically disadvantaged students, we had a slight increase last year, reaching a district high of 14.1% of our students. Next year it's projected to be 14.2%, so hovering right around there. When we do look at the sharp increase happening about 4 years ago, we do want to keep in mind that we can see it happening kind of throughout the state. There was a change at that point in how the state was collecting economically disadvantaged data, and so it's just important to kind of keep that in mind when we see those trends shifting up sharply and then kind of leveling off. When we look at special education, our students identified as special education decreased from 2009 to 2016. It dropped from 10.4% to 6.6%. However, since 2017 or so, we've been increasing slightly to 10.4% right now. So not large changes overall. And then county and aspiring districts are really staying stable between 11 to 12 and 10 to 11% respectively. So we're right in the area of our county and aspiring districts.
Candace, what does aspiring mean?
We're going to talk about that in a second. We just redid those. Let me just get to here specifically so I can make sure I cover everything. Our aspiring districts are districts that are considered high achieving. And so this year we did review all of those. And what we did was we looked at the report cards from last year, since we don't have all of the other schools from this year yet. And we ranked them on their report card scores from highest to lowest. And then we took the 15 highest scores that are also suburban school districts with populations of over 1,000 that are also K-12.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I could just comment on that. So that's something that's been in place, and maybe this is what you're going to comment on, Larry. Sorry if I'm stealing your thunder here, but it really came out of the Baldrige process as we're looking for benchmark. Who do we benchmark against? And so that's that high achieving, high benchmark group.
But previously, the aspiring districts had been, well, we're not 100% sure even on how they were handpicked or picked and stuff. And so it was before both Mike and I and stuff. And so we wanted to have some criteria for how they were selected. And also we knew that it was time to relook at them. There were a couple of aspiring districts that we just simply knew their results had changed over time and stuff. And so, this was a nice kind of recapturing with some criteria based on it. So again, we're looking at like the top 15 in the state who look just like us.
And when we look at
Based
the
on the
rankings, we'll
criteria
see
that
them.
you come up with.
Right.
So, yes, back to the Baldrige, it's, the data is based on the levels, trends, comparisons, it's comparative data that's out there. And yes, we need to have rationale, the reason why we picked those groups and how we fit into that grouping of
Yep.
comparative data set.
Yeah, so you'll see a number of charts or graphs tonight that'll show in our performance in comparison to that group.
And then it's the same group kind of compared overall. So you'll get to take a look, and we can pause on a couple of the slides to really look at which ones they are.
Thank you.
Any other questions on demographics?
What's a microphone, just a tad bit
Yes.
closer?
They thought I was super tall, and I was not, and I probably did it too long. Is that better?
Not much.
There. Is that better?
Talk louder.
All right, I will try. I will
There
push
you
it
go.
out there. Yeah, it's me.
Thanks, Jordan.
My voice does not carry. I apologize. All right, so on to student achievement data. The first component we'll look at is our STAR data. This is our internal district screener. We use it for RTI, and then students take it multiple times a year for classroom groupings as well. So this is STAR Math expected growth, and so it's the percent of students that met their expected growth by the end of the year. So from their starting score to the end of the year, did they meet the growth that we would have anticipated them to meet? Growth ranged from 54% in grade 8 to 78% in grade 5, and the other grades for math were largely in the 60s to 70% range. So kind of clustered together, looking really kind of tight. STAR Math is given from grades 1 to 8, so we'll see a couple other grades on reading. STAR Reading. Similarly on how the growth is decided, students ranged from 50% in grade 7 to 76% in grade 3. The STAR reading was a bit more varied, so we see some percentages in the 50s and then up to the 60s and then into the 70s. So not quite as tight as math, but still some good growth hitting for students taking STAR. STAR is taken down to 4K. It's their initial literacy screener, and so that's where we see it here for 4K and 5K, and not in math. They don't take math until first grade.
Can I ask you a quick question on those it just occurred to me. Otherwise, I would have asked you this ahead of time. But so those end of year growth targets, is it kind of assumed that 50% is about on average of what you would see, like everybody?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
anything
it's,
above 50 is really kind of.
Yeah, so a student has a 50% likelihood of hitting their target growth. So in theory, 50% of the students should hit their growth and 50% of them shouldn't. That would be on a nationwide trend. So anytime we're pushing above that 50% mark, we're hitting above where students would be nationally.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I have a question, and maybe help me clarify this one. So if typically the, third grade reading level is over there, how does this equate to that? I mean, are we having students read at third grade reading level?
So this would be, so when they take their test at the start of the year, they get a every student then, based on how they did in the fall, has a projected growth target.
Okay.
And that was kind of my question. Usually these targets are kind of built on a norm or an average of some kind. And so that was my question is it generally expected that half kids will meet or exceed and half kids will fall short of that? And that's what you answered. So when I see grade 3, 76% meeting, meeting their growth targets, that's a really strong number. So this is very individualized, correct, based on how they did as individuals in the fall.
Correct.
And then what their individual projected growth is.
So to go into Larry's question a little bit, it does differ from proficiency. So growth, I might, if I'm a third grader, let's pick an easy score. This is not a real score. Well, it's a real score for lower performance on STAR, but not for a third grader. If I'm a student in third grade and I score 100, that score may or may not be proficient, but I'm still going to get my growth score to say from the beginning of this year until the end of this year, this is where you should grow, and you should grow, let's say, 100 points. I could get to 100 and technically still not be proficient, but meet my growth in saying that I have made 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. And so it's a little different from proficiency.
So for proficiency, we look at both forward results. We use Fontes and Pinnell, which they individually confer with their teacher. That tends to be a little bit higher than the forward exam because the teacher can ask more probing questions to be able to get into more depth, and then look at their classroom performance on the standards as well. So it's not a real cut and dry, this child is at reading level or not, and stuff. We look at all of those data sets and triangulate that to determine which students need more support.
Is the growth number, is there subjectivity in it, or is it objective? Like it's just set by
Stars, yeah, it's a standardized assessment, so it's just set, yeah.
All right. So when we move into forward math, this is where we're kind of taking that change from talking about growth to proficiency. Did the student meet the benchmark for their grade level? So if we see forward is taken in grades 3 through 8 and 10. 10 does their social studies test in forward. Everything they all do is for ACT otherwise. This does exclude PLE. So we'll see that a lot of the data we're talking about doesn't focus on PLE because the state assessments really start at grade 3 with Horizon. It's also important to note, just as a heads up, that in 2019-2020, students did not take the forward exam due to COVID-19, and so that's why there's like a little missing line there. It's smoothed out in the chart, but if you're looking for years from year to year, they did miss it. The only test that was taken that year was the state ACT, and so when we get to the state ACT, we do have 2019-2020 data that we've added in. So for forward math, proficiency ranged from approximately 42% in grade 8 to 78% in grade 5. Grade 3 had some slight decreases, but is still really on the high end of where other cohorts were at, and when we look at prior cohorts. Grade 4 decreased, and this really is kind of important to note. We see last year's grade 4 kind of popping out there, and we see them this year as the blue line really popping up again. So we're really looking at a cohort that is starting to become an outlier, meaning that they're going to potentially be different from the other cohorts around them. So something to monitor and just watch for.
So that would be something where we would probably likely expect to see grade 5 come back into that normal trend line that they're in, and grade 6 to pop up next year, because this tends to be, it looks like this is trending to be a high flying group, and this was a group that again didn't test in 3rd grade because of COVID.
So grade 6, higher performance than last year, but really kind of on par with other years, looking really coming back to normal versus the last year grade 6 performance. And then grade 7, slightly higher performance this year. And what's really kind of fun to note for grade 7 is that if we kind of track them back a little bit, they're doing a bit better than their last year cohort. So if we look, they have improved over their performance from last year. So we see that 54.5 from last year to 61.6. So pushing them up really in the right direction over time. And then grade 8, they improved slightly over last year, about 5%. So really hoping to head back to prior years there. Forward ELA, again, as we go through forward, all of this is going to be about proficiency, so we moved away from growth. Grade 3 and 4 are really on par with prior performance. Grade 5 exhibited a dramatic increase in proficiency over the prior years. So this class not only is starting to exhibit that outlier display in math, but also in ELA. Potentially grade 5 might come down a little bit next year, and so just something to keep in mind. Hopefully, if they did come down, we could still take away key notes from the learning of that cohort and keep them higher, but just a little bit lower than potentially this cohort. Grade 6 is slightly lower than last year, but not greatly lower. And then on ELA here, when we look at their performance, they are the green line in 2018-19. So in grade 3, that really dropped down. It's really, really good to see that their performance over time has increased by about 13.5%. So it's really nice to see that while they're really on par with other grades and really coming up out of a decreased score from 3rd grade. And they kind of had that a little bit in the prior years too. Grade 7 on par with prior performance, and then grade 8 experienced a large improvement over last year's scores, really popping up to show similar performance to 2017-18, which is really good to see.
Do you guys watch the class trend?
Mm-hmm. We watch both cohort trends, where the class trends as well as within a grade level.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you can kind of anticipate and project. You know, we had a couple of really high graduating classes a few years back, And we'd been tracking them all along and say, well, that's going to be a good ACT year when that group gets up there. And so you really, cohorts are, you get stronger and weaker cohorts of,
Right.
of students. And so that's something that's really important context for the data that you're looking at. Like Candace's point is, next year, or for the current year's fifth graders might do well, do just fine, but they're going to, likely be a drop from last year's because it was such a high performance from
Are-
that particular group.
Are you concerned when the percentages for a certain class go down, or is that not concerning because the material's getting harder? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, is it kind of
There-
expected, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a general range, right? Like
Okay.
if it's within a couple of percent, like one way or the other, that's usually sort of expected that they're just going to kind of trend in that line. If it's a more pronounced drop, yeah, absolutely, that's something that we want to pay attention to, or a pronounced increase, right? That sixth grade is a good example, because again, with the COVID year, they don't have grade 4 data in there, so they're the green line in grade 3, they're the purple line in grade 5, and then the blue line in grade 6. So you see that they were like 46, 40, almost 49, and now 60, so 10% increase in 1 year. Even though grade 6 was 4% roughly, 3.5% less than the cohort prior.
Oh, right,
Still,
yeah.
a 10%
Big jump,
gain for
yep.
kids is right. So
Yep.
it's important to look at both ways.
Yeah, and to your question, sometimes it's really important to look at what is the state, what is the county doing at that particular grade level, because you can tell by looking at those averages, is the test harder at that grade in general. So in general, a lot of times you might see scores or proficiency, because proficiency is always this bar, right, that you have to achieve. And so sometimes you'll see different grade levels where, yeah, everybody's scores or proficiency levels are lower, and then that's why that comparative data really helps you tell the story, because sometimes it's just a harder test.
Interesting, okay.
Teed us up perfectly, Mike, for the next portion.
You may have partially answered this, but, I mean, if you look at like the grade 5, the blue, light blue here, and then the previous slide too, I mean, like, they just, like, in that grade 5, they're just like outliers almost in comparison to previous. What's up with grade 5? Did they have like an influx of?
Ate their Wheaties that day, huh?
Yeah, it's a little hard to say because we didn't test them in grade 3, right, and stuff. But we did see them as an outlier last year in math. Now they're displaying it in both math and ELA. So it's appearing that they're just a particularly strong cohort that's coming through. And sometimes we get those. We had that with a graduating class a couple of years ago.
2019.
Yeah, 2019. They were always high flying.
But I mean, their prior years, I mean, 'cause that's their prior year data.
Yeah,
Their
grade
prior-
4, yeah, not entirely sure, like, what all of a sudden got them to transpire up and stuff, but that's something that our coaches and administration are talking and working with teachers on to say, what did we change and do differently that, allowed us, to gain that?
That's a big jump.
And they would be the students that, if they were grade 5 in last year.
They're our 6th grade right now.
Or 6th grade now. So what transpired in those buildings for the teachers, right?
Pete?
What happened?
I'm sorry, I was talking about, what was the question?
No,
We were talking about,
That's what he was
yeah, we were talking about some theories on why that big jump was there. That group has been involved in learning sprints for a couple of years, so we think that that's a factor.
The teachers have been, yeah.
The teachers have been, so those kids have been experiencing that for a few years. They did a really good job last year, I think, of differentiating instruction, going back to using groups versus kind of whole group instruction. We think that was probably a big factor too. Student goal setting, I think, is a factor. Kids being aware of the work that they're working on and the things they need to make improvements on. So yeah, it's awesome to look at that chart and see all those boom, boom, boom right in the middle, and then, the question is, how do you do that to the next one?
Right, yeah.
Right.
But that's exactly, Pete, what I was trying to get at. I mean, is there something that occurred where there's some interventions or some different instructional techniques, or something happened within that 1 year cycle? Because, I mean, it's just like, whoa, I mean, they kind of moved up. So if something happened in that 5th grade, what happened in there?
So, well,
Or-
the teachers.
Hey, Pete, could you come up by the microphone, because people on live stream won't be able to hear you.
Hey, everybody.
Thank you.
Live stream, how you guys doing?
The teachers would say that one of the big changes we made was time of day for the testing. They really feel like readiness for when the kids take the test could be a factor. We like to think kind of more holistically on things we've been doing with kids for years or things teachers have been doing with kids for years. This really helps us when we push on practices like learning sprints. It's a challenge for teachers, especially this year as we move into more collaborative learning sprints. This becomes things that we use as proof. It was a great group, and I'll talk a little bit about that in our presentation too. We're actually really going to miss those kids. They had kind of a different experience. If you think about their experience, we do all these wonderful things in our building with our kids besides academics. For a couple of years, we didn't do a lot of those things. So one of the theories is because they were so locked into being in the classroom with their teachers a little bit more full time, that there was some more direct instruction and some more focus on academics versus some of the other cool stuff. So.
You know, we've also seen, you know, teachers respond when, you know, you see a dip like grade 5 saw in the year prior from 55 down to 49, right? When we see those kind of dips, our teachers really, I think, do a great job of getting even more into the data and finding out what they need to change and engaging with things like learning sprints. So, you know, I think a lot of it too is their dedication and analysis of data. And we spent a lot of time last year, at least 2 hours of every PD day was spent on data analysis and making instructional differences and changes based on real-time data.
But that group, so they were 49 in grade 5, and we don't have grade 4 for them, so in grade 3 they were 47, right? Am I reading that right? Am I tracking that right?
Yep.
In 2018-19, they would have been grade 3.
No, that's
No,
the
that's
missing
grade
year.
six.
They
Right,
did-
but I skipped.
They would have gone 59.
Oh, you're right. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I got you now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
50,
Okay.
58. And then,
Then 73.
That missing year,
The
really.
missing
yeah,
year.
it's
Yeah.
tricky.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
A few more years we're going to have to contend with that.
Kick it out. All right. So we're moving into those rankings now, and we'll look at the high achieving districts in a moment. But just taking a look at the county ones, grade 3 in math maintained the higher ranking similar to last year relative to the county. And that's even with that slight dip in their score from 82.5 to 76%. All right. So when we move to the high achieving, these are the districts that account for those high achieving districts that we just talked about how we chose them from the report cards. And these are the ones. So we are looking at Muskego, Norway, Cedarburg, Mequon, Thiensville, Shorewood, Slinger. Pewaukee was the 16th one. We tried to look at 15 other districts to compare. Grafton, Elmbrook, Sussex Hamilton, Oconomowoc, Menominee Falls, Waunakee, Whitefish Bay, Germantown, Kettle Moraine, and Altoona. Altoona is probably one of the odder ones on there, but we do see through different grades they really kind of pop up in their performance. On this one, that happens not to be the case, but we do see it in other places, so it's good to take that into consideration. For grade 3, we do see a slight dip compared to those prior years, last year, but not really compared to the other 3 years, really maintaining a higher achievement ranking relative to those in math. When we move to reading, we have a very consistent hold on the 5th for the county. Let me change that for you. So even though we went up slightly, we really kept our same ranking there, which holds if we compared it to last year, we would have kind of been in the same place, 60.4 last year. That same place was 60.6 to kind of get above the next district.
This is a good slide to sort of keep a snapshot in your brain for when we get to 6th grade and how we talked about that cohort increasing, right? But where we see them from a ranking standpoint, right? So they're that 18, 19, one down, second from the bottom, and stuff in
their own.
3rd grade. And then just kind of keep this snapshot in your head for when we get to 6th grade, and you'll be able to see then their change in ranking.
And then looking at the high achievement rankings, we see just slightly more of a dip, but not really a lot of change for that grade 3. So they're really maintaining high rankings relative to last year compared to the 3 years prior, a bit higher, but just in summary, doing better relative to those other 3 years. Moving into grade 4. We have county math. The ranking for fourth grade math dipped down. It's lower last year, but it is slightly higher than the other years when we take a look at it. That 62% proficiency ended up being a little higher than 2018-19, 63% proficient when we take a look at the rankings. But this is where we kind of start to see that fifth grade cohort, when we look at them in the next year, how they were that outlier sitting here this year. Moving into the high achieving, we see the exact same trend, drop from last year, but very much on par with prior rankings. Looking at it. When we move into the county reading, they're on the lower end of normal, but still kind of within that range of where we've been in the past, meeting right at the 2017-18 rankings. Nudging up wouldn't be bad, but not out of the ordinary when we look at the past comparisons.
So this even shows that grade 5, while ELA really took a jump in 5th grade for that group, even in 4th grade, they were our highest ranking cohort we had previously.
And then similar for county rankings, high achieving reading rankings for grade 4 are on par with prior rankings as well. The upper end-ish, but definitely on par.
One thing I'd just point out too is we reside in a very high achieving county. So when you talk about, because we have the high achieving benchmark districts, the majority of the school districts in Waukesha County are very high achieving. So especially a lot of the K-8s that are feeders have extremely high performance.
Yeah, we're talking about the top 15 districts, in a state that is in the top 10 in the country for some of its achievements. So, we're really trying to, battle at the very, very top.
For forward, grade 8 and grade 4 are the only grades to take science. So we're going to slightly detour off of math and reading to take a look at those county science rankings. Here for grade 4, really staying on par to last year's higher rankings relative to the last 3 years. So a bump up in 2021 and maintaining that bump up this year, moving down just one tiny little place.
With some of these numbers, I mean, given that ranking within the county, that some of like the lake countries and Swallows and Mertens, is it class size? I mean, or what? I mean, because these numbers are like way up. I mean, like the 69 to 91.
It's
I mean,
demographics.
It's demographics primarily. They just serve a very different population than we do.
That would be the primary
Yeah.
difference.
So moving into the high achieving districts, slightly lower than last year, so we see a little bit more of a pronounced drop relative to county districts, but still doing well relative to those 3 years prior. And this is only accounting for a little bit of that 3% drop, so not a dramatic drop in percent proficiency, but we see it playing out a little bit more in the rankings where this 21-22 had quite a few more districts in the 70s than previously. And then social studies. So for social studies, grades 4, 8, and 10 do take forward. That's the only forward test grade 10 takes, so we transition to the Aspire test for grade 10. But for grade 4 and 8, we'll detour and take a look at that as well. In social studies, we saw quite a jump up in percent proficient, so moving from 66 to 76%. However, this only accounted for a little bit of an increase in our ranking. So overall, many districts went up for social studies this year.
So kind of coming back to your comment too, Muskego, Norway is in one of these at this point. I mean, here they're kind of like ranking, for the last 3 or 4 years, very much the same. Is their demographics a lot different than ours?
I don't know that Muskego, Norway is. I'm talking more like the K-8 feeders.
Feeders and Arrowhead.
Those tend to be very affluent. And it just is what it is. High affluency generally results in higher achievement scores. We're also affluent, but not as affluent, and so you do see that as having a factor. And some districts are doing some really good work. So Muskego, Norway, I would assume has a pretty similar demographic to Pewaukee. So there's some things maybe to learn from them.
I'm gonna ask a different question then. So with something like this, in terms of with Muskegon, Norway, what's the takeaway from that? I mean, if we look at that over years, what's the takeaway? What do we, should we be out there looking at what Muskegon, Norway is doing, or is there something that's,
Yeah, so when we did the curriculum review, which, was approved in social studies in spring of '21, and science will be coming to you this spring, those are the schools that we contact and say, what are you doing? What's your scope and sequence look like? And sometimes we'll hear or see things that we agree with, and sometimes we hear or see things that we say that doesn't quite fit our community values or the way that we want to approach things, and stuff. So, but yeah, those are the districts that we connect with to learn from. So you'll see, like, from a county ranking standpoint, and even our jump in our score, we went up slightly in grade 4. It's up more pronounced in grade 8 as well, and that's 1 year into a new curriculum, right? So we always watch it for a couple of years as we go through curriculum trends as well. So just to see that after year 1, we're moving up in social studies, and it's more pronounced in grade 8 and was even more pronounced in grade 10. Those are the trend lines that we want to start seeing when we change curriculum.
Yeah, and similarly, you see some strong improvements in math scores, and we are in year 3 of Bridges that we've been using. So the curriculum process does just what Danielle described. You look at high achievement, and then you reach out and try to see what kinds of approaches or things that they're doing.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, and I think I went back a couple slides. So back to social studies for grade 4 for the county. We just took a look at that one with that little bit of a jump. So moving into the high achieving social studies rankings. Here we see for high achieving that the 10% increase for our students in proficiency still resulted in a stable ranking. So there is quite a bit of a jump of proficiency, but other school districts experience similar jumps, and so we're still in the same place for ranking with the high achieving piece. Moving into grade 5, the rankings remain the same, even with increased proficiency a little under 5%. So seeing something very similar to what we just talked about in social studies, where our rankings stayed the same, even though we did increase in our percent proficient because other districts also increased their students' proficiency. High achieving, we increased in our math ranking, so there's one difference. It's one of the few. When we look at the county, we didn't really move, but when we start to see those high achieving, we did move up relative to the high achieving districts. Moving over to the county reading, so here's where we see that very pronounced grade 5 increase in reading, and that had a very pronounced increase in our rankings. So moving from towards the bottom fairly stable to much closer to the top of the rankings in the county. And then similarly in the high achieving, this moved very, very close to the top. Just need to squeak by Cedarburg at some point to get up there and be the top school. But very, very good overall. Being second is not a problem sometimes.
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize some of the elementary data that we've seen, obviously there were plenty of highlights where we saw growth happening, in many areas, and in particular, I think math, again, generally speaking, kind of ticking up. There's also a couple of areas where, we want to refocus energies. 4th grade, went down. We know that we're pretty sure that cohort ahead of them is high, but nonetheless, right, again, what are going to be our takeaways from that cohort that we can apply to future cohorts down the road? So kind of specifically, some action plans we've already put in place. Of course, we've had this data internally since the summer. We did not have our comparison data until it was unembargoed just about 3 weeks ago. So we too didn't know the comparison data until just the last couple of weeks. So just in the last few weeks, we've really been starting to do these action plans in earnest now. We, like last year and the years prior, we set learning sprint goals based on that triangulated data of setting 1 year's growth, increasing proficiency, and looking at our formative assessment data to be able to move both cohorts as well as individual students forward. In ELA, as you recall, you approved a new curriculum in the spring, so closely monitoring the implementation of that. Today we had an implementation check of that new curriculum. Saw lots of great things coming out of that new curriculum, particularly in writing at the elementary level in the first few weeks of school. And you guys heard a little bit about that at our last Spotlight on Learning. We did a lot of professional development specifically in ELA over the course of this summer, including bringing in some national folks to help us on writing strategies and reading strategies. And we are also focused on helping our interventionists build their toolkit. Today we had roughly 25-ish interventionists from across the region come, and we hosted them to spend about an hour and a half with each other, learning from each other. So folks from KM, Arrowhead, New Berlin, we're all here with our interventionists, K-12 interventionists. And then we also are increasing our communication of student progress on proficiencies. So proficiency scales are going home more than they did in the past, so that we're communicating with parents more frequently about where the status of their students' progress is, instead of really kind of waiting for report cards. This is especially true at PLE. Where they hadn't been sending them home with as much frequency as we're expecting this year. And so today we had some good professional development on that as well, continuing to help our teachers be able to communicate most effectively with our parents, because we know parents need to be engaged and need to be that third leg in the stool of students, staff, and parents in order for a child to learn and be successful. In math, a lot of similar things, continuing to do learning sprints, continuing to do professional development, specifically on Bridges, that resource, and how to best utilize that resource and materials. This year, we will be reporting our K-5 coding computer science standards for the first time on report cards. This is the second year of implementation, but we're actually reporting on it on report cards. And just a couple of hours ago, Colleen Rooney told me that she was approved for a pilot program of how to integrate computer science into other content areas through code.org, which is a primary resource that we use to support computer science. And so that's really exciting. That's a national pilot that she'll be able to be a part of. And so, you know, computer science is hard for our elementary teachers. That is not something that they were trained how to teach. And yet we know our kids are coming to us with skill sets often beyond the adults. And so that's a great challenge for us to figure out how to continue to move forward with that, because the transferable skills are really, really profound. And again, continuing in math to communicate on proficiency. So those are some of the kind of overarching elementary action plans. Our principals tonight, when they present to you, are going to provide even greater detail about what's happening in the building and what happened last year. But happy to take any elementary questions you have before we continue on with data at the secondary level. Larry?
I have a question, sorry. Intrigued by your interventionist involvement with it, so could you talk very briefly about the why, and then what do they get out of it, and what do we get out of it?
Yeah, so I mean, we know that we have students who have an achievement gap, right, and who are struggling, and so really important for our interventionists to have a really wide range of tools to use with different students, because they may do an intervention for a period of time, you know, usually 6 to 8 weeks, and then learn that that intervention is not moving that child forward. And right, it's the definition of stupidity to keep doing something and expecting different results, right? If you're not getting the results on the front end. And so we got to make sure our interventionists have a wide range of tools and colleagues to collaborate with, because, you know, there aren't a lot of them in a school. And so, so it's been important to get them a lot of cross-training.
So are some of the interventionists coming from the high achieving districts as well?
Yeah, today was KM, Arrowhead, New Berlin, and us who were able to make it. I have a regional group that I meet with monthly of C&I directors, so it's the county primarily, and so it was open to anybody in that CNI group, regional group that we often collaborate with. That's who was able to make it today, but we've talked about having future experiences together once we get the feedback on how today went. All right, let's look at the secondary.
Grade 6. So looking at the county math rankings for grade 6, we see a very slow trend upwards after a little bit of a decreasing trend from 2017 through 2019. However, when we move to the high achieving math 6th grade rankings, we see a little bit of the inverse trend. We see a little bit of a decline over those same years. So it's really coming down to looking at the different districts and how they're trending in comparison. We look at the county reading. They are lower this year compared to prior classes at 60.4%. However, this is that class that we noted had the very low performance in their grade 3, and they were second from the bottom, and they've really come up to be more similar to other grade cohorts when we look at their rankings now, which is a really good improvement over being very close to the bottom for that
So
cohort.
room to grow, but
Right.
good growth for this cohort.
And we see a little bit of the same story when it comes to their high achieving, lower than prior years, but really sticking a little bit higher than that, very close to the bottom. Moving to grade 7 for the county math rankings, we see a bit of an increase for this grade. So the increase in their percent proficient also resulted in an increase in their rankings, which is ideally what we'd like to see. Similarly, for the high achieving comparisons as well, the direct increase resulted in an increase in their rankings. Moving to the county reading rankings, we see a slight decrease, and this is again one of those points to kind of note. They did have an increase in their proficiency over prior years, so moving from 62.6%, and that was up from 59.9%. However, it still resulted in a slight decrease, so other districts were also able to improve their performance on the grade 7 reading assessment this year. High achieving resulted in the exact same ranking relative to prior years, so very stable. In grade 8. Grade 8 takes the pre-ACT as their district assessment in the spring, and then they also take their forward assessment as their state assessment in the spring. So there's 2 assessments here. And when we look at the pre-ACT and forward percent proficient, they don't always line up. And so here we can really see that the pre-ACT English, reading, and math proficiency is much, much higher than the ELA and math proficiency on forward. In science, it's a little bit of a different story, where the forward exam was higher, and then there's not a direct social studies component of the pre-ACT. Moving into the county math rankings for grade 8, they really had similar rankings to where they were in the past. So coming up a little bit from last year, still when we look at their straight percent proficient, lower than those prior years, but coming up to meet them as far as rankings. So also suggesting similar and kind of the opposite direction of other grades and their subjects, whereas this slight increase is very, very different from those first 3 years, that other districts are also kind of struggling a little bit to push up their proficiency for grade 8 math in the county. High achieving districts, very similar to last year, but lower than the 2 years prior to that. County reading. Went too fast. Jumping up to 59.1% proficient, and for the reading exam, this differs a little bit from math. They were able to really push up that ranking with that large increase in percent proficiency. Moving into the high achieving districts, very similar to the county, in which the increase in percent of students proficient also resulted in an increase in the rankings for students relative to high achieving districts. Grade 8 science, very stable across time. We see really ranging in that going up and down, up and down, up and down ranking, kind of varying whether the score is 59% proficient or 62% proficient, really ranging in that same trend line. However, when it comes to the high achieving districts, we were able to inch slightly up in the rankings relative to other districts. County social studies, very similar, really hovering around that same point. This does need to take into effect that there was just under a 20% increase in percent proficient, but it did not result in large jumps in rankings. So other districts in social studies on grade 8 were able to increase their students at a similar proficiency level. And then similarly for high achieving, we see a little bit more of an increase there, but not very much movement relative to the movement in the percent of students proficient.
So just one note is that last year, if you recall, we had a lot of conversation around our middle school performance, right? Particularly grade 8, but middle school performance in general. There's still work to be done. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, overall, we're pleased to see that, you know, the scores went up in all the grade levels in math. We're starting to see a trend in the right direction. You know, we have work to do there, but of all of the buildings, I think ASA was under the greatest microscope around their achievement and, you know, some changes that we needed to make in our approaches with instruction in that building. So generally pleased to see it going in the right direction. In some places, 7th grade in particular, some really nice gains, and reading in 8th grade, some really nice gains, kind of back to what we would normally expect. And so, you know, we continue to have very specific instructional strategies that we're working on in the middle school to continue to improve that. But I do want to, you know, just give credit to our middle school in particular, because the microscope was close on to them all year, and they responded, and, you know, we were able to see some growth. Not there yet, but definitely going in the right direction.
Danielle, I think some of these gains were even more impressive because there were a lot of other issues going on in the middle school too. Last year
Absolutely.
we were talking about behavior, which really interferes with academics terribly.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So, and, you know, to take this in the spring when behaviors were at their all-time high, you know, does speak to it. And we're definitely seeing some trend data with the pre-ACT in 8th grade. We saw that with the year prior, and we'll talk a little bit more about action plans around the ACT suite of tests that we're now able to do here in just a little bit.
There you go.
And again, maybe a question, I don't know, but from a statistical analytical standpoint, go back to like one of the county social studies rankings, okay, there. I'm not giving up on this just yet, so you know and understand. So with the smaller schools, the Swallow, the Merton, the Lake Country, all those, I mean, are those like, you know, 20 or 30 students that we're comparing with? Is like our classroom size or class size is not anywhere near what we would have here, right? I mean, their number of students is not that high. I mean, they don't have like a couple hundred
Yeah,
students.
they don't have 200 students in each grade level, certainly not. They have, yeah, much smaller. It varies, I think, between them. Swallow, I think, has 1 or 2 classes per grade level. Lake Country or Heartland Lakeside's gonna be a little bit bigger.
Well, and I think a lot of those are also experiencing some significant declines in their enrollment too, so.
Yeah,
know if that
yeah,
makes a
I
big
don't know
difference
enough
or not,
about
but
the
when you look
details
at
of each of
the number
them.
of students, your sample size and the distribution, if you will, of normal curve kind of students, it's gonna be different in those smaller settings, and if, again, the demographics are there as well. That's all.
Yeah, I think, and I heard Robin behind me saying it, she said ranging 60 to 80 per class, and so they would have a much lower class size relative to us. For the county, and I know we've talked a little bit about whether it should only be like K-12 districts, but part of it is when you see things being published or anywhere else, we want to make sure that you're able to see all of the districts that are right around us rather than like strategically taking out county ones. We can do that for the high achieving, but we want to make sure when we look at the county, we do get a full picture of everybody around us. Grade 9 Aspire. So this is the last year that students took the Aspire exam. It is ACT Aspire, so they will be moving to the pre-ACT which is a test we've given internally as our district assessment. 8th graders have taken it in spring now for the second year, and then our 9th and 10th graders also take it in fall. And so with the move from the state assessment away from Aspire to pre-ACT, we'll be able to have some good trend data monitoring students from fall to spring for their growth in a single year. So for grade 9, they are all trending a little bit lower this year with the exception of reading. Relative to past classes, reading for grade 9 popped up a little, about 6%, whereas the other subjects declined a little bit.
So keeping in mind that this was the 8th grade the year prior, that was pretty significantly low.
When we move into grade 10, we see a little bit of two stories going on. Math and science increased compared to just last year, and then really are very similar to a few years prior, whereas reading and English decreased compared to last year. English is still really in the high range relative to prior years. High scores over the 75% proficient in English are very common. Reading is a much different test, and that one is just slightly lower but higher than other years. So good to see while it dipped a tiny bit, it's not really trending down at this point in time relative to other cohorts. And then looking at the ACT, this is the state ACT that the students take in grade 11. So all grade 11 students take the ACT on 1 or 2 given days in March and April, and this is the score that they get. If students take the ACT outside of those dates on their own for their own personal reasons, that's not included in this one. That would be a different data point. So for grade 11,
I was just going to say, when we get to the action plans, I'm going to talk specifically about the ACT. I'm not a fan of this data because we're looking at trend data here now, right? This isn't just COVID related. We have a 5-year trend because the ACT was the one test during COVID. They were able to get in before the shutdown and stuff. And so I'll talk specifically about what we're doing regarding ACT in just a little bit.
so as Danielle noted, for grade 11, overall there was a general decrease in ACT average scores this year. That is consistent across every subject, resulting in an overall lower composite score. When we look at the composite scores for the ranking, those lower scores have translated also into lower rankings relative to our county districts for the composite score, as well as a lower ranking relative to high achieving districts for the composite score. And then consistently we start to see a little bit lower trends for math relative to county scores, not quite as dramatic of a drop as we saw in the composite scores, but definitely still going down relative to other county districts. And then when we look at the high achieving, we also see a fairly pronounced drop for ACT math scores on high achieving districts. It is worth noting that there have been some curriculum changes in the course lineup for students in grade 11, and Danielle can speak more about those class changes.
Yeah, so if you remember, we moved to an integrated math model. This grade 11 was not a part of that, so our now current juniors will be the first group that will have taken any part of our integrated model. So still our highest tracked students in math for both our current juniors and our current sophomores would not have been an integrated, but we're going to see the vast majority of students starting with this 11th grade class this year having been in integrated. So the math scores over the next 2 years is something we're going to be watching closely now to see the impact of integrated. If we look at Aspire in 10th grade, we saw a little uptick in math, right? That's 2 years into having integrated for those students. So some evidence that the integrated thus far is working, but this ACT in particular in math will be something we're watching closely to see how that integrated model is doing. So our juniors gave us some evidence that we needed to go in a different direction. So the good news is we did.
Continuing with those juniors on the grade ACT reading scores, that declining score also resulted in a decline in their rankings relative to county districts. Similar to the high achieving, the rankings also declined as well. And And then again in English, the county rankings decreased both to the county and high achieving rankings. When we get to science, it also decreased relative to county districts and high achieving. The high achieving is more pronounced compared to last year. When we look at the prior years, it is not quite as pronounced. It is still on the low end of those, just a little less pronounced than when we look at last year specifically.
So one last comment I'll make on ACT before we get into this, and then I talk action plans a little bit, is just that one of the challenging parts about this year's ACT is we didn't have great data to suggest that this was going to be predicted. They had performed fairly stable in 9th and 10th grade on the Spire, which is usually the predictor we use, and stuff. So they did not. We're not really sure exactly, like, in that regard, like, where things turned for grade 11, but nonetheless, the trend data over the last 5 years is what concerns me more, is that we're seeing that declining trend. And so, you know, that's where we set action plans based off of, is the fact that we have to reverse this trend, and that it's in all subject areas, not just in, like, one particular area. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But there is some good data coming out of the high school, so we don't want to give it all a bad picture. There's some real positives here too, so we wanted to be sure to include this.
Did you track, did other schools see these kind of declines?
Ours were a little bit more than most area schools around us.
I was just wondering if the change in colleges not as much requiring means the kids, you know, because kids that want to go to college will start taking it as sophomores. They have a couple tests under their belt by the time they take this one. But if the other schools aren't seeing it, then maybe it's not the explanation.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely are seeing it in some of them, you know, overall. But, you know, overall as a state, we stayed really pretty stable on the ACT. So, and when we look at the high achieving districts, those are decent comparisons. One thing that the state made sure to caution us against is that comparing yourself to other schools that would have had dramatically different participation rates because of COVID was something to be careful of. But we know, we can assume that the districts that we're comparing ourselves against are going to have pretty similar participation rates.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
they
just
did.
one thing I'd say to your question. I mean, you can look at the state averages on some of these two at the bottom, and you can see where the state scores have went. So everybody was down a little bit in 2021. You can even see the top scores are lower, right? The state went down, you know,
Not quite
7/10
one.
of a point, and then they stayed relatively flat, slightly up this year. So, and we saw some of the statistics rebound, and you know, we didn't. Again, it can be cohort, can be different things, but you know, it's something we're definitely paying attention to.
And this is just maybe a curiosity question. So Oconomowoc has, do they follow the International Baccalaureate kind of program? But I mean, their results are kind of not off the chart, right? They're kind of in there, right? But
Yeah, I mean, whether you're IB or AP, it's very similar. It's really just which one do you prescribe to and stuff. You know, you're talking, generally speaking, about your students who are probably going to do pretty well on a standardized exam, you know, and so that population tends to erase each other out a little bit amongst all comparisons. It's really that middle group is the group that's going to kind of shift you one way or the other.
Moving to the AP data, which was a little more positive, 79.9% of students passed their AP exams with a 3 or higher. So that is the highest it has been since 2013, which is the last year on that chart there. And then the number of credits earned in credit-bearing programs has been steadily increasing since 2018-19. So we've moved to 1,203 credits earned by students, and slowly increasing since the 790 in 2018-19.
Yeah, and that's a lot due to increases in programs like dual enrollment, so WCTC's programming, their associate's degree program, right? So these are a lot of credits earned in the technical trades and growing those programs, as well as our shift to a few of the CCIHS, the college credit courses instead of AP courses. So this does not count AP credits in this number, just because depending on where a student goes depends on the number of credits they would get. So you can add on top of that all of the AP credits that students will have earned as well. So when we look at action plans in the secondary level, a couple of important things to note. One of the most important things that we're doing is that really for the first time ever, we're able to set growth goals using the ACT suite of assessments, because we give the pre-ACT in spring of 8th grade and the fall of 9th and 10th grade. And that ACT is switching to the pre-ACT for their state test in 9th and 10th grade. We are finally able to get some trend data. Usually, right, it's just every spring, and we can't mark and see how we're doing along the way. And so it's really hard because it's all autopsy data. But we're actually going to be able to set growth goals, which we have done, on what a predicted score should be for a child if they're taking the pre-ACT or the ACT that following spring. And then we're going to have that mark here in the fall. We just did that a week and a half ago. We'll get those results back in about a month, and be able to see, are we on trend for that 1 year's growth to hit that mark or not. And so today we shared all of that growth goal data with our high school staff. They were able to take all of their students in each of their classes, and they now know what score bands students in their classes all sit in. So we'll be doing some very targeted professional development now over the remainder of the year on how to target ACT standards and skills in their classes, instructional strategies for them to enhance in their classes, also how to differentiate within their classes for the different groups and target score ranges, because we know that if you are too high or too low of where your curriculum is hitting, right, you're not going to be helping the students there. So you need that like just right level of next level of rigor, and we're going to be able to be much more targeted with that this year. ACT did something that they called concorded the data, where they were able to take Aspire scores and pre-ACT and do that prediction all the way out. And Candace and Becky with their magic were able to get us those growth goals that we're able to use now. So that's really exciting, having been in the high school my entire career as far as trying to figure out the academic data you can use in real time. It's really hard. We don't have a standardized test like STAR or MAP, and this is all autopsy data. So yes, you can go by, grades, but at the same time, that doesn't give you enough pieces of evidence and information. And so that is very much a target. Kudos to Brian and his team for taking this on head on and saying this isn't good enough for us. We need to do better. We will do better. The staff today, I thought, responded really well to all of that. And then we're going to do, like I said, targeted professional development. Part of that includes the fact that we have a new ELA curriculum in all of our schools that we're continuing to monitor. We did PD this summer, just like we did at the elementary level. This second to bottom one, continuing deepening of disciplinary literacy and vocabulary strategies, is a really important one. So Dave Zindler spent time with our non-core teachers today, talking to them about how can they have students reading with a purpose in their content area, whether it's Phi-Ed or culinary arts. Like, you got to read a recipe, you have to read directions or the rules of a game. How can that be a disciplinary literacy strategy to take advantage of? The vocabulary program Dave has stretched now down into the middle school to build, and that's all based on ACT vocabulary. So that's now going to be scaffolded all the way up during a child's experience with us from middle school on. And we're also looking at that scaffolded focus on research. That's a bit of what Paul Hassman and Aaron Yeskis were here presenting a couple of times ago. So, one of the things that we're intentionally doing as well is trying to help build your capacity as a board in understanding things. So our Spotlight on Learnings have been intentional as far as bringing you forward some of the instructional strategies that we're doing to really be responsive to the data that we see in front of us. Math is similar to English in that we're again looking at those growth goals. We're doing intentional student grouping based on the data at the middle school as well. So the middle school has STAR, so they've in learning sprints, they've been doing that really for a while now. So I bring up the ACT just because that's our newest one, but all of this is also happening at the middle school. And again, professional development for our teachers and interventionists, specifically on the curriculum resource. One of the things at the middle school we want to, and high school, continue to focus on is to lean into our primary resource to support, finding the gaps that students may still have, achievement gaps, and being able to shore those up. So there's a lot happening that's very targeted, specific to the ACT, but really specific to all of the data results that we saw at the secondary level. So the last thing that I just wanted to bring up is that this is all standardized test data, right? There's a lot of it, but that's not the only piece of data that we use to inform how we're doing. We obviously saw AP data, and we saw credit-bearing data. Our principals are here today, and they're going to be talking to you about a lot of the graduate profile data that we have that we also track, right? Because we have 6 competencies. Candace and I have primarily talked about the compete competency. But there's some other ones. So I just wanted to pull out a highlight from each of our schools. I'm going to let them tell you the story of their schools from last year, but these were a few things that I thought were really awesome that happened in our schools last year. We don't have a literacy achievement gap between students with disabilities and students without disabilities in 4K from last year. That's not to say we don't have students who aren't proficient yet or at reading level, but there's no discernible difference between the students with disabilities and students without disabilities as they enter into 5K, which I've never been able to say that before. I just think that's awesome, especially you guys know how much we've been working on that 4K program, so kudos to Robin and that team for the work that we're doing there. At Horizon, we had 88% of our students lead their parent-teacher conference, being able to explain their academic growth over a year, which, these are 8 to 11-year-olds, to be able to lead their parents through their academic growth. And so just the deep understanding they have of where they are as a learner and where they need to go, I just think is awesome. We saw an increase in math scores and counting comparison rankings in all of our grades at Asa Clark. We saw great growth in ELA there as well. But again, I mentioned it already. I just think the microscope that they were under, the fact that they took that to heart and did a lot of work to start to improve where we're at. We still got some room for improvement, but going in the right direction. And this one, I'm a particular favorite of just because of my relationship with the Insight program, but 53% of the class of 2022 had an individual career mentor for at least 1 year while at the high school. We had 29 students total in 2015 when we started the Insight program, and now it's not just Insight. Our students in our alternative education program have mentors. We have 3 or 4 classes that aren't a part of Insight that have just said, I want my kids to have a mentor too, and we've gotten them. So I believe over 200 mentors this year that we're working on, and so I just think that's really powerful as well. And so those are just a few other data points that I wanted to celebrate. The principals are going to talk a lot more about other things happening in their buildings.
And then just to wrap up tonight on the data presentation, these are the 22-23 assessments that will be given over the course of this year. So STAR is our district screener given to students in grades 4K through 8. It is progress monitoring tool for RTI students as well. COGAT, the gifted and talented screener for students in grades 3 and 5, pre-ACT in the fall, grades 9 and 10, access for ELLs, that's the state assessment for English language learner students in winter, and then the forward exam, dynamic learning maps, and the state ACT coming up in spring for those grades, and then the pre-ACT also for grades 8 through 10. 9 and 10 will have it as their state assessment, grade 8 will have it as their district screener. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming and being here with us in person.
Of course.
Thank you, Candace. Good
Dealing
job.
with the turbulence of Montana.
Yeah.
Rough flight.
It's always rough when she flies over Montana.
All right. Moving on, we will go to our school building and teaching and learning continuous improvement reports. Danielle, who do you want to start with?
So we are going to really start with Mike actually
Yeah.
on this one, once we pull the presentation up, and he's gonna give us a little framework.
No rock, paper, scissors?
You've heard plenty from me tonight. I'm gonna try to stay quiet, more quiet than
Aw.
usual.
Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. One more. There we go. Okay, so go back one. All right, so this is part of our cycle. This is what we're here, tonight. The report that you just saw, what you're gonna hear from the schools, the department reports that you're gonna get subsequently at our next meeting, is really this just a component of our larger continuous improvement cycle. And so you can see that reporting and initial implementation. So this is when you're getting that major report on all of these metrics. That's why we started early tonight, right? Because we know we have a lot to get through and to look at. The initial implementation happened at the same time, right? So we spent a lot of time analyzing things over the summer. Plans were developed, including strategic plan, tactical plans for this year, as well as school learning objectives and all the kinds of things that Danielle was talking about, with improvement for achievement this year. So that's where this comes from, is that this is a major event in the year for the board, and your important role as our accountability in terms of how we're doing. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we are reporting out regularly to the board and to the community in terms of what our performance looks like, and that we are able to provide analysis and articulate that we have plans for continuing to get better. And I think you've already heard quite a bit about that from Danielle this evening, where we see things going well. We're happy about it, but we want to understand why they're going well and how we can kind of continue that momentum. If we see things that the trend isn't as good, what are we doing about that? And that's what we're here to work on is all right, this is something that we're noticing. We want to understand it, and then we want to have an approach to try to make it better. So this is an important night for the schools then to talk about their specific school goals, and we're going to kind of work our way through. If you want to give me to the next slide, Julie. All right, so the purpose of these reports, really at the department and school level, is to provide you a report on performance related to strategic initiatives. From the schools in particular, you'll hear about graduate profile initiatives, as well as school improvement goals. You've heard about learning sprints mentioned already tonight. That's been a major strategy in some areas, so the principals will talk about that. And then what can you anticipate? What are those next steps that is going to happen at those building levels to continue to improve? So next slide, and we're going to go to Pewaukee Lake. Mr. Siegel.
All right, good evening, everyone. So last year we focused on math as our building goal. We used the Comprehensive Growth Assessment, or the CGA, from the Bridges curriculum. This was our second year focusing on math. And what we did is we tailored to key standards at each grade level. So each grade level had a different focus. We took baseline data in fall and set our goals for spring. So I know it's very fine print in the CIR report. You can get to all the details of it. I included even some of the winter growth targets. But you can see there in 4K that we surpassed both of our targeted goals for both subitizing to 6 and number combinations of 5. In 5K, counting to 100 is a huge skill, as well as decomposing or breaking down numbers. In both of those areas, we hit it in counting to 100 with 90% of kids being able to count to 100 or greater, and then nearly 90%, so surpassing our target of 85%, we're able to decompose numbers. And then as we get into first and second grade, we had adding, subtracting within 20. We didn't quite hit our goal in that for first grade, but when you look at where they came in at only 21% proficient with that, we made growth of nearly 54%. just came up shy, but we set lofty targets even with that. Problem solving, as you'll see in first and second grade, we didn't quite hit our target, and what we noticed with that is that the structures that we were using in our baseline data in fall of the types of word problems they were seeing weren't the same types of word problems that we were assessing for later on in spring. So instead of looking at the same structure that they saw in fall, as they learn new structures in first grade and second grade, that's what we were assessing. So it wasn't so much their proficiency on a skill throughout the year. It was at that time. So we've adjusted that for this year, and we're going to assess in the same structure that they've been working on from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So we identified exactly why we didn't see the growth that we thought we would, and that's because those skills that they were assessed on in winter and in spring were newer types of structures that they would see in problem solving. And then in second grade, we hit our goal for addition fluency, came up a bit short in subtraction fluency, but you can see there that we made nearly 30% growth as well. And problem solving, once again, we know where our issue was from what we were assessing, not so much students not being able to achieve in that area.
Brian,
Go ahead.
sorry. What does subitize mean? I actually looked it up. That's not in the
Subitize?
dictionary. Subitize, is that how you say it?
So subitizing is when you give students, you basically flash a structure in front of them and they can name what it is. So it could be in a 10 frame that have 3 dots in there and they automatically know that it's 3. Or it could have like 3 apples scattered over. You hold it up, they can see it. You hold it down, they know exactly what it is. So it's identifying numbers quickly. And that's up through 6 at 4K.
Thank you.
And that way, when they see structures in different forms, they're very confident in knowing what that is, and they don't have to count every single time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on some of the goals. One of the things to always keep in mind, we set those targets for ourselves in goals like this, and what we always encourage is, kind of the SMART goal, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, results, oriented and time bound. So, but you want them to be a stretch and a challenge. So that's why it's really important that we look at the amount of growth that happened, and it would be very easy to have them all green. And so we met our goal, we just had, if we set low benchmarks. So that's one thing I'd always keep in mind is that we're setting ambitious goals.
So because we focus on math with our building goal, this past year with our learning sprints, we focused on literacy. So every PD day we revisited our learning sprints and looked at our successes and where we can grow. We had some fantastic numbers coming out of 4K last year of uppercase letter ID. 84% were proficient with this, lowercase 83%, and letter sound ID 88%. Letter sound ID is a huge indicator of emerging readers. So think about even before 5K, how many kids are hitting that proficient mark of are they going to become readers when they hit 5K. Then for 5K through first, you can see that we are focusing on their running records or F&P levels. You can see there in each grade level what they came in as a grade level, as an average. And then when we did our spring formal assessment of every single kid, you can see where they hit at that point. And I also indicated where they should be by the end of the year. So for like 5K, you see that in March they were at a D. By June, they should have been an E. And I just put a note in there. We oftentimes worry about a summer slide. But you can see that the type of instruction we're giving kids in reading, that summer slide on average is not really there. So the current first grade, their grade level average is an E or an F, where they should have been or slightly higher than where they should have been coming out of 5K in June. Same thing with first grade. They were at an I in March. The goal was an I or J by the end of the year, and the current second grade group has a grade level average of a J or a K. So that summer slide that we oftentimes worry about just hasn't been there for the past couple of years with our students. And then second grade, in March, they were an L, and by June, they should have been an M, so very close. And also at each grade level, you can see the percent of kids either hitting their year's growth target in their F&P level or their STAR growth for literacy. And there we're in the 80s of hitting one or the other, oftentimes, or not oftentimes, but many of them also hit both as well. So opportunities for improvement here. This year we are turning our attention with our building goal to writing. It's oftentimes one of the harder things to pinpoint. Measuring reading growth and measuring math growth is a bit easier, but we're turning our attention to writing, and I'll get to kind of where the opportunities are for that later on. We're going to continue to develop play-based learning. We're going to continue to really work on the science and social studies curriculum in 5K, building off of what we have learned from 4K. Learning sprints this year, because we are turning our attention to writing for our building goal. Learning sprints are going to be focused on math. So with math workplaces and bridges, there are set activities that kids are doing. How can we be more intentional with teacher interactions with students and target specific students and specific skills in key areas of the workplaces, to see how, our coaching or the way that we interact with them in that game, we can really use as a high leverage moment. So not just playing a math game, but how can we use that as a teaching opportunity for them? And then, as Danielle alluded to earlier, we're really working on parent-facing proficiency scales to inform parents about growth throughout the quarter, not just that snapshot at the end of the quarter of here's your quarterly grade, here's your semester grade, but the progress that they're making on the way towards that summative grade. In the graduate profile, Contribute, we had nearly 99% of kids participate in some sort of act contributing to either their classroom, our school, or the surrounding community. Lots of opportunities. Oftentimes, it was making cards for veterans on Veterans Day. 5K really worked on keeping the hallway clear during the winter months when boots and snow pants can get all over the place, but being responsible for their things, knowing that kids are going to be passing along the hallway. So the way that they contribute to others can look a lot of different ways. In Create, we made a huge push on looking at inquiry and design thinking, and 97% of our students participated in activity in each semester. In Compete, we went through a lot of these numbers. Again, so I'll kind of skip over that. The self-selected goal, we're going to get to that when we get to the commit portion of the grad profile.
Brian?
Mm-hmm.
98.5 and 97 is awesome. I mean, it's essentially 100, but it's not 100. Is it
Yep.
special ed kids, or is it?
So there are certain students that we have taken out because we know that it's not that those types of activities may not be appropriate for them. So because we're looking at Contribute is every quarter, there are some kids that they were gone when their class did it, so so we can't count them as they did a contributing project in all 4 quarters. Or for Create, they may have not been there for a portion of time when their class did their inquiry work, their design thinking. So because they did it in 1 of 2 semesters, we can't count them as a part of the overall goal. Connect, this is one that we really hold near and dear to our hearts because we know that when students feel connected to other kids and other staff in the school, that's when engagement really picks up, and that's when they feel a part of a learning community, and that's when achievement also goes up. So to see here that nearly 99% of students in 4K feel connected to other students, and 98% of them feel connected to staff members in their classroom, that's huge. And then in 5K, 100% of kids feel connected to kids within their classroom and connected to staff members besides their own classroom teacher. That was nearly at 99%. So in 4K, 5K, that was more of a yes or no. In first grade and second grade, we have them score on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being, I don't feel like I have any connections at all. 5 being, I have a ton of them. So we really focus on those kids who are a 3 or higher. So student connections within the classroom in first grade, 100% of students felt that way. And students outside of their classroom, we're getting at areas like recess, which can be a huge factor in a student's day. That was at nearly 90%, at 87.7% felt connected to students outside their classroom. And you can see their staff connections, 3 or higher, was at 96% with our first graders. And in second grade, same thing. Within the classroom was at nearly 96%. Outside the classroom was at right around 85%. And then staff connections, 3 or higher, was at 87%. So you can see the percentages, but then I also included in that 5-point scale what the average was within there. So that takes into account those who also marked 1s and 2s in that number average versus just 3 and higher. And then the last two, commit. So you saw this as a part of the compete data. This one we felt wasn't truly reflective of the work that we did. Classes set either classroom goals or individual goals. The way that we measured it was the class hit the goal or they did not hit the goal. So oftentimes with like a 5K class, nearly everybody was meeting that goal of like an academic goal of we want to sustain reading for 20 minutes. Nearly everyone did it, but maybe a couple kids didn't. So the teacher would mark, no, we did not meet it as a class. So what we did is we just changed the language on marking for that this year of made no growth, made some growth, made significant growth in the terms of the goal that they're setting, so that even though a couple kids didn't, they can say that the class in general still made significant growth. So this is something that we see really nice numbers for, but we don't feel like it's truly indicative of students achieving any of their group goals or individual goals that they have. So we're hoping to see some different data to give us a more accurate picture next year. And then 100% of our students participated in a weekly survey regarding their wellness, how they are feeling, did they eat breakfast, and for the older students, how do they sleep?
A quick question on that one. That seemed like a little bit like 100% of the students are participating in that survey?
So that means that even students with additional needs that may not have the communication, their special ed aides or special ed teachers still checked in with them about how they're feeling.
Okay.
So other highlights, last year for our Encore nights, we introduced a new one, a fall family night hike. We're doing it again this Thursday. Bring your flashlights, it should be fun. We already have 260 people signed up for the community, so we're really excited about that. Book of the Year was back for an in-person celebration. That was great, and then Spring Sing, if you weren't here for that, that was incredible to see them back on the field for it. So those huge celebratory parts of who we are as a building, we were able to get back, and we're happy to see that.
Thank you, Brian. Great job. Any other questions for Brian and Peely? Oh, did I
Got one more.
cut you? Sorry, we got one more. Looking ahead.
So looking ahead, we have a learning lab classroom right now. We've gone down to 9 sections in first grade, leaving an empty classroom. So our learning coaches had an idea of using that as a space where teachers can bring their class to and see a lesson modeled by the learning coaches. As a part of our DWA, District Writing Assessment Days, teachers are going in there to learn with our learning coach, and then we're bringing a classroom in. The learning coach will work with a small group to model it to the teachers. Then the teachers will quickly talk, and then they get to pull their own group. So it's learning hands-on right in the moment. We're doing that because we have the ability with the extra classroom. So we're really excited about what we can achieve with that. Field trips, they're back. First grade went to the zoo already. They loved it. Second grade's going to the Retzer Nature Center tomorrow. They're really excited. We've got expert listeners and math mentors back, we're really excited about. And today was our first day of doing Open Doors PLE during Professional Development Days. And that's where teachers are learning from other teachers. Teachers open up their doors, talk about some things that they're doing, to show that to and showcase that to other teachers. So it's not just learning from people in district and administration, was teachers connecting with other teachers and showing them what they're already doing in best practice within their classrooms.
Right now, any questions for Brian?
I think that's the last one.
Thank you, Brian. All right.
Thank you, Brian.
Good job. Mr. Gull.
Hello, thanks, Brian. Real quick before I leave this slide, I want you to look at the motto that's there. We started that motto about 3 years ago, so the students who are currently in 5th grade, that was the motto that they came into the building with, and the thing I want to focus on is every kid. So I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to bounce forward here. I want you to look at the pictures on the screen. I'll talk more about what's some of those activities later, but I want you to look at the student in the upper right-hand corner. One of our 5th graders, at the end of his 5th grade year, also at the end of his time at Horizon School. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like his overall experience. He represents one of like 207 kids, I think. So kind of keep him and those other last year's 5th graders in mind as we walk through last year's experience. We talked a little bit about our goals, and multiplication fluency is the thing we focused on for math across the building. Reading, we broke it down to reading comprehension. Lots of success, not just using the STAR as an assessment tool to measure this, but also to generate data that teachers turn right back into information they use to create groups. We did make a change when it comes to using the CGA. We did use the CGA throughout the year to generate data, but it was a comprehensive test. It was a pretty big test, and it wasn't specifically focused on multiplication fluency. So about halfway through the year, we did make a change, and you'll see that in the data, to using one-on-one teacher and student fluency interviews. We feel like that was a better measure for the students, put the teachers and the students in a more comfortable one-on-one environment, and the teachers could probe a little bit more. So I feel like that was more usable data. As Mike said, we could have all kinds of green on these slides if we tried. We set pretty high goals for ourselves. In reading, we were pushing to 70% of the students achieving that 1 year's growth. You can see in the middle where we started the year and the growth we made towards the end of the year. Really proud of that 3rd grade group, as 72% of the students met that target. Even though the 5th grade group had high scores, they started pretty high as well. So not quite as many of those students were able to meet proficiency, and a little disappointment there with the number of students that met 1 year's growth. And one of the strange things that we would talk about is how that doesn't really match the other data, the F&P data and the data that we saw on the forward exam. We focused again on multiplication fluency, using the same standard really over that multiple years. It's really a 3-year goal. At the end of the run for our 5th graders, we were hoping that 90% of them would hit that multiplication standard. I made it green. I hope that's okay, Danielle. It's like 89.1% of the students met that standard. So we were really excited about that growth, not just for our teachers, but also for our students. So our successes or our highlights, some celebrations. I wish those were a little easier to see, but I'll kind of paraphrase some of those. In literacy, we performed in performance. We increased in performance across grade levels. So that was a really big jump for us. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is the performance of our students with special needs. Across grade levels, those students also increased their performance, and we were able to lower that gap at every grade level. We talked about the rise in multiplication fluency, again at all levels, starting with a really low 4% at the beginning of the year for 3rd grade, moving almost all the way up to our target. And then we're really excited. You saw all those green and blue bars for our 5th grade group when it came to the forward and proficiency on that, so we're excited about that. Some things we're going to work on improving, not so much strategies for instruction. We're talking more about improving the environment in classrooms that we think will create better situations for teachers to teach and for kids to learn. We're moving from learning sprints just being focused on kind of smaller things to really differentiating what teachers are doing and focusing on the kids, kind of making the sprints not quite so convenient and making them collaborative as well, so that teachers are accountable to each other as they work through that process. Using the philosophy of whoever is doing the talking in a lesson or in an activity is probably doing most of the learning. We're going back to pushing on small group instruction. You'll hear me talk a little bit about Tier 1.5 intervention. That's really the teachers taking control, the classroom teachers taking control, whether it's during win time or whether it's during other small group time, both for academics and behavior. And we're looking closely at our building policies and procedures, and especially our philosophy on school-wide discipline and school-wide behavior, moving away from a more punitive model, which we've been trying to push away for a few years, but focusing our PD and our conversations and our practices on a collaborative model with students actually taking control or being part of that process. So something we're excited about. So when it comes to our profile data, we're a little disappointed, and we don't know that this is a great reflection. We think that two things happened. We pressed pause on some of our all-school activities as we got into January and February. We felt more comfortable mixing groups. We felt more comfortable leaving our spots in the building and potentially going to other buildings or having those people visit us as well. So some of our numbers, I think, are lower because of that. I also think there was some miscommunication on our end on how to record participation. Really, most of these are just participation scores, and those are things we have to look at. We have to look more at what the student experience is, not just how many kids were able to participate. So some of these we showed great success. Danielle pulled the one about so many of our students being able to pull out their portfolios or a presentation and drop those on the desk and explain their growth, the things they worked on, the things they need to work on with their parents or other audiences. It could have been me, it could have been classmates. So there were some really great experiences there. Talked a little bit about our compete goals. Those are comprehensive of the whole building. Some solid success there. Connect, I think, is another one that we didn't do a great job of recording. Connect and Create were also very closely related. So if you do one of those well and the other one kind of follows along, kind of went in the opposite direction here. And those are two of the goals for this year that we're rewriting to kind of a wider range. Commit, we were very excited that students were able to demonstrate their resiliency, again, through those conferences or through some reflective activity. And Care, that number does look a little low, 71% of the students regularly using the tracking survey. We moved from doing it, the year before this year, we only used it a couple of times during the second semester. Second semester last year, we went to using it weekly. So even though it looks like fewer students actually use the survey, they actually did it on a much more regular basis. So other highlights, we're back to that student. Think about his couple of years prior to this one. We had situations where kids were learning from home. We had situations where we were really limited. When we talk about small group activities, we actually for a while were asking our teachers not to pull the kids together in groups and to keep kids separated. So that was part of his and that fifth grade's experience. So we're really excited to have volunteers back in the building last year and this year as well. March Madness returned last year. We opened up our maker space again to get our hands on those activities and have some collaborative activities there. Veterans Day presentation, a modified version of that took place last year. High Interest Day returned. High Interest Day is also a great time for us to incorporate some of the grad profile activities. We got back to camp last year, first time in 3 years. We didn't stay overnight, but we did go 2 days in a row. We had a fantastic talent show at the end of the year, so anybody who got to see the fifth graders perform, we had over 20 acts get up and perform, including some of our staff, so that was great. And I really think a highlight of last year was over 1,000 family members and students came back to campus to participate in our Encore Highlight Night. I still like Horizon Fest, or Encore Galore, I think was a better choice, but it was a really great night. So, yeah, we had that drum circle. We had multiple performances. I know Larry got to get in one of those courtyards and play drums for about a half an hour. So another really great experience that we were able to share with our students and families.
Of course you
That was a highlight for me as well.
Yeah, remember when we walked over there, you were like determined to make sure. And then we got around the corner. There's probably 30 or 40 drums out, and there were times where there were people waiting in line to step up and participate in that. So it shows how many people were there. It was a great night for the arts, Phi-Ed, our foreign language folks also did some really cool activities. Some things we're going to continue to work on for next year. We talked about using that Tier 1 intervention. Much of that's going to come through win time, pushing ahead with more use of the small group instruction, embedding SEL skills into core instruction, not leaving that just to our counselors or just to our psychs. Those learning sprints are going to be more collaborative than they have, and we were able to start work on those today. We're going to embed grad profile planning into each teacher's plan for the year. So the few teachers who have met with us already to talk about their personal learning plans for the year also have embedded goals, taking a little more control away from us and back to the classroom or back to the students. Thrilled to have math mentors and expert listeners back. It's interesting that Brian said the same thing. And as we kind of turn the page, as that group of that fifth grade group left, turn the page to a brand new group of kids, and kind of in a different era where it feels like we're returning more to normal. We're working with a new vision. We have a new motto. We also have a new theme. We also have a brand new mural on the right on the wall above our cafeteria. That's our new motto for the year. We think that this motto is more reflective of where we are now. It's more inclusive. This tells kids and staff to be curious, to be kind, and to get through the things that we've gotten through recently, to be unstoppable. So, thanks.
Thank you, Pete. Does anybody have any questions for Pete on his report from Horizon?
I have one question. Can you talk a little bit more about learning sprints and the changes that you're trying to make?
Sure. Last year it was, for some folks, it was more about exposure, and we were actually pretty flexible on what we had teachers or asked teachers to write those learning sprints on. So they did look at data. Remember that in 2 of our grade levels, teachers specialize. So we had a group at each grade level that worked on reading goals and math goals. This year we've kind of selected building-wide through our data team the goals that we're all going to start with. So instead of teacher A focusing on some kind of fluency and teacher B focusing on kids being able to solve word problems, they're going to do that more collaboratively.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks.
Mr. Pizzo. By the way, I should point out that Pete's making a big effort today because he threw his back out doing yard work this weekend, so he's hurt.
When I saw him today, I was full on like old man mode.
There may have been a cane involved at some point today, so, but I see he didn't bring that prop tonight. So.
Thanks, Pete.
Mr. Pizzo.
All right, so the middle school. We have, for the last 2 years, we've had a literacy and math goal for our priority goals for our school. And I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at those in the CIR reports, but the difference with both of these goals is there are multiple measures to identify whether students meet success or not. And those measures include both growth-based goals and achievement-based goals. So Larry, you had kind of asked about, growth versus achievement. So there are measures in both of those goals that allow students to demonstrate where they're at specific to literacy and math. For literacy, we really wanted 70% of our goals to meet 3 out of those 5 identified measures, and for math, 2 out of 4 identified measures. And if you take a look up here and you looked in your packet, you can see that 42% of our students met expectations in ELA, and 72% met expectations in math. And if you listen to Candace's data presentation, it's almost reversed, right? We had a little bit lower performance in math on the Wisconsin Forward and some of the standardized tests. But in working with Candace, it is statistically harder to meet 3 out of 5 measures than it is to meet 2 out of 4 measures. So that might be the difference in the discrepancy between the 72 and the 42%. Just looking forward to this year, our goals do look fairly similar, but we do have 4 measures for both math and literacy looking forward this year. So some of the successes. We talked a little bit about some of the discrepancies that we see specific to our 8th grade students with the Wisconsin Forward and the pre-ACT assessment. For whatever reason, our students always seem to perform better on the pre-ACT. And the only thing I can put my finger on is that for our 8th grade students, it is the last year that they are taking the Wisconsin Forward outside of social studies as a 10th grader. So I think there is probably a little test fatigue when they take the Forward as an 8th grader. With the pre-ACT, it's the first time they're taking the ACT suite of tests. They get a projected ACT score. It seems, in talking with kids and working with teachers, that assessment seems a little bit more real for the students. So we had some successes there. 86% of our 8th graders, which I think, we want to make sure that our students leaving 8th grade are ready for high school. 86% of our 8th graders were identified as proficient or higher in English language arts, and 76 of our 8th graders were identified as proficient or higher in math. Both of those were the pre-ACT. Now, we did have some success with regards to social studies on the Wisconsin Forward, where we had 73% of our 8th graders who were proficient or higher. So recognizing that and to be honest, our 8th grade math performance on the Wisconsin Forward has room for improvement, they were able to demonstrate in a different standardized assessment that, they are doing some good things. So we are continually working specifically on that 8th grade math group. So some of our opportunities for improvement. Sorry, I apologize, that's a little bit small, but the first one is really like the fidelity of our math instruction 6th through 8th grade. We'll be in year 3 of the adoption of the Open Up Math resource, and really ensuring that the way our 6th grade teachers are using the resource is similar to the way our 8th grade teachers are using the resource. And a big shift this year is the use of lesson cooldowns. So part of the resource involves what are called cooldowns, where students have the opportunity to demonstrate their learning on that specific lesson, and then teachers can use that specific data to make adjustments for the next lesson. So making sure that all of our teachers 6th through 8th grade are using that with regards to math instruction. 2 and 3 are a little bit interrelated. Our student support systems and interventions, we are further looking to improve implementation of our instruction related to social emotional learning, and making sure that we are not only making really good students from an academic standpoint, but really good people as well. And then also kind of tightening up some of our behavior expectations and the interventions we use from a behavior standpoint with our students, because, I think Jeannie, I think you brought it up, I think last spring, I think at times some student behaviors got in the way of their own learning. So making sure that we have systems in place to support those students. All right, so with regards to our graduate profile, contribute, create, and connect are kind of all encapsulated into a design thinking process that all of our students engage in over the course of the year that benefits the school, the local, or global community. So all of our students use the design thinking process, and at each grade level come up with a specific project to do that. So 100% of our students participated and completed that. Our compete goal is tied directly to those math and literacy goals that I just spoke about. Our commit goal is that 100% of our students provide evidence of personal resiliency, an initiative through a student-led conference. That occurs at the end of the school year. 96% of our students met that goal. And with regards to our care measure, we want all of our students to develop a personal care plan to manage their own care, but then also to support the well-being of others. We did not meet that goal. 100% of students did complete the plan and regularly updated the plan, but there was a data collection issue where they had to click submit to Canvas, and actually only 31% of the students submitted it, but they all had it done, they just did not submit it. So just working on that technical detail for our care goal. So other highlights, we returned our extended learning days, which happened 4 times throughout the course of the school year. The purpose of those days are to connect student to student and student to adult around activities that may or may not have anything to do with academics. So it is students offering sessions and staff members offering sessions on things that they have interests in. So we have students engaging in a multitude of things on those days. Last year we had flex periods built into our schedule where teachers worked with groups of students to focus on the graduate profile competencies and on those academic interventions. So that was the time that we used to focus on skill groups and learning sprints with our students. We did implement a Connect survey last year, similar to what Brian had talked about. The goal of that is to make sure that every student in our building has a connection to other students and also to other adults in the building. We did implement data review processes at the middle school where each quarter groups of teachers, math, science, social studies, language arts, got together, reviewed data from the previous quarter, and then used that data to then work with some of those groups of students during learning sprints during the flex periods. And last year, we finally were able to implement student support meetings. So we obviously have a house model, and one of the benefits of that house model is you have 3 teachers that predominantly share the same 75 students. So it's a lot more difficult for kids to slip between the cracks. So we meet every 2 weeks to talk about students and any students that may need additional supports. We had plans to do that 3 years ago, but with COVID and not having people in the same room in close proximity, we did not. So last year was our first year of getting that up and running. And then looking ahead, one of our big focuses this year is going to be probably returning to some instructional practices that we had in place pre-pandemic. Making sure that pendulum swings back, focusing on appropriate use of technology. And when I say that, like, the school laptop can be a great tool for learning. It can also be a great distraction. So making sure that we're using technology to support student learning, really focusing on those components that every lesson should have, 6 through 8, focusing on assessment. So we have developed an instructional playbook, and our teachers are working to make sure that, you know, when you walk into a math class or a language arts class or a technology class, there are some differences content-wise, but the structure of how a lesson is structured within the classroom looks similar. So students are familiar with the routine of that lesson. We did a ton of work over the course of the summer, and Mrs. Spadoni did a ton of work. She gets a lot of the credit with this, but kind of reanalyzing our behavior support systems that we have in place, really to make sure that we have processes for us as administrators and teachers in the classroom to support positive behavior, and then consistently working with students to respond to that behavior, both from a restorative standpoint, but also from a progressive discipline standpoint. So really looking at tightening up some of those things. Any questions?
Thank you, Anthony. Does anybody have any questions for Anthony and Asa Clark?
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
All right,
Thank
great
you.
job. Mr. Sniff.
How's everybody holding up? I always get to do this last for you guys.
Lucky you.
I got to stretch just to get some circulation going.
Any back problems yet or anything along those lines?
Saw me standing.
All right. Are you clicking or am I clicking? Oh, it's right here. Got it. Okay. All right. So at Pewaukee High School, would you like to talk about ACT or would you like to talk about something else? Ultimately, as we went into last school year, one of the big pieces of concerning data that we were focused on was the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data. I shared some of those specifics within the report that I gave to you. But ultimately, our students, their use of screen time during a day, their sleep at night, their diets, all those sorts of things are something that continue to be an area of concern. I mean, they're high schoolers, so there's a little bit of that goes on regardless. But coming out of the pandemic, with mental health being something that was really in the forefront, this was something that we really wanted to focus on as we entered into this year. In addition, around the idea of creative problem solving, which is really what some of the background for CREATE is, if we want to engage our students in that process, we also have to engage our staff in that process. We need them to think differently and to be innovative. And what had been happening over the last couple of years is a lot of kind of pockets of innovation. And we wanted to look at a way in which to systematize some of our innovation and have our departments work more effectively as a department. Sometimes I refer to our teachers as working in parallel with one another. You know, you do what you're going to do in your classroom, I'm going to do what I do in my classroom. They get along great, they talk with one another, but are they really pushing each other to become the best that they can possibly be? And so we want to invest in the process of learning within our departments to enhance the learning experience for our students and be able to innovate and be an adaptive school as we move forward. And that actually I think is going to play into, our ACT plans as we get into this year. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to use my own laptop here. So ultimately, some of the results that we had, our students engaged in the wellness tracking process throughout the course of mainly our homerooms. So that would primarily affect our grades 9 through 11 students. And our focus was really on our 9th and 10th grade students. So we wanted to have 50% of all of our students be able to have engaged in the wellness tracking process. Now the interesting thing, some feedback at the end of the year, because what they did was they shared this with their parents at the end of the year ACP meetings. And the students are still disconnected from this. They groan when I ask them to turn, in my homeroom, when you have them, like, hey, we want you to fill out your wellness tracker. Where are you at as far as the goals that you set for yourself? You get a little bit of that, like, oh, all right, I'll do this. But the parents actually were really positive in their response. It prompted some really good conversations within some families. I can say today, actually, my 16 or 15-year-old student sent me a text while I was at work, and he was at home, and he said, Dad, can you block YouTube from my phone? Because ultimately he was recognizing he was wasting a lot of time on YouTube. And he's like, then you can just unblock it when I need to research something. I was like, sure, if that's what you want me to do, I can do that. It's that kind of self-reflection that we're trying to get kids to just simply even note the idea that they have this amount of time that they're investing in social media or YouTube or games or whatever it might be. And the tracking device is intended to kind of highlight that for themselves. Not have us point it out to them, but for them to pay attention to it for themselves. They are high schoolers, so their willingness to do that and reflect upon their data is something that we're still working on, but ultimately we think this is valuable work for them to engage in. As far as the CREATE piece, we wanted to go through 2 cycles of the Plan, Do, Study, Act with our staff, where they would set a goal for the fall semester, go through the process, and then set a goal for the spring semester. Ultimately, the work that they were doing did push further than just one semester, so they did go through 1 round of that throughout the course of the year. We had a really great share-out session in the spring of last year where teachers, the departments shared out with the rest of the staff, and we went through a critical feedback process, and they ultimately set new goals for this school year as well. And produced really nice results across the departments. And ultimately, each department had their own thing that they need to work on, something that was germane to them at that time. Math wanted to focus on assessment. Science wanted to focus on finding online resources for their classroom. So there were differences between the different departments in what they wanted to focus on. Some of the successes across the building that are tied to some of our goals, and the compete goal in particular that I wanted to highlight here is this, some of these items that were mentioned earlier tonight. Our AP scores were really high. Our post-secondary education credits earned, 1,203 credits, is tremendous. We continue to expand innovative courses across our Insight program, adding aviation, adding serving others, and really trying to find more of those authentic and relevant learning experiences for our kids. The interesting piece, and the mentor expansion is another one that continues to grow and getting students to meet that CONNECT criteria, and we'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. And we're also sharing that across a lot of different classes, including alternative ed. This is not something just for our high-level students to be able to be having access to. We think all kids need to have a mentor and get engaged and be inspired about a potential industry that they might want to pursue. But this aspect of the AP placement scores, as well as the this post-secondary education scores, is one of the things that really has been a big conundrum to me with the ACT scores, because we have very capable kids. They've proven themselves to be able to do well. These AP classes, these credits that are being earned are our juniors that are doing this. And so to see that drop in the ACT scores has been something that really has been shocking to me. We could spend a lot of time trying to diagnose that and maybe explain it away. We've ultimately chosen not to do that, and as Danielle alluded, we're tackling that problem. We want to make sure that we're tending to the ACT. As we've tried to innovate, as we've tried to find more authentic and relevant experiences, we haven't been talking about the ACT. And so some of those tasks that we've been doing in class on a day-to-day basis have maybe not been in the forefront as they have in the past. And so that's something that we're revisiting to make sure that we tend to those results. So that's ultimately the opportunities for improvement, as I mentioned. We need to figure out a way to cultivate some enthusiasm around creative opportunities, such as impact. So our impact course, where students can engage in design thinking, has not garnered the enthusiasm. In fact, we're not running it this year because we have not had the students sign up. They really vote with the courses that they take, and so that's an area that we wanted to see expand and get more kids engaged in the idea of doing deep research into an area of passion for them. But right now, they continue to take some of our more traditional courses, and so we have to find a better marketing campaign and a way in which to engage kids in that process. And I think Mr. Gull alluded to some of the data gathering techniques and efficiencies. There are some things that we need to try and clean up. Our end of the year ACP conference process which is really where we gathered our data for care and commit. Wasn't quite as clean. We made some improvements for this year, but ultimately, or for last year, but ultimately they only made some improvements for the end of the year, and so we would like to continue to work with Candace and Adriana and see if we can improve our data gathering processes. Just a quick overview of our graduate profile from the contribute standpoint. This is where students are engaging in service learning across our building. Last year what we wanted to do was pilot and implement Transio as a way to just simply track the data. And so we started with NHS and Key Club. This is a place where students are already engaged in service learning, and so it's a really nice program to use, and so they did pilot that, and we were able to get some baseline data where 13% of our students were meeting the goal of working towards that 25 hours of service learning before graduation. One of the ways in which we're expanding it this year, Jeff Behrens has worked with his athletic teams to have our athletic teams engage in a service learning project as part of their season to try and give back to the community. The community is so supportive of our athletics program. This is a great way for them to get out and give back. I know at the Booster Club session this weekend, one of the things that was given away was having the football team work in your yard for a couple of hours, and I can imagine that having a bunch of strapping young lads and one young lady that's been highlighted recently would be a great asset to anyone's yard. I'd hope so anyway. Our create, again, what's that? They can move a lot of mulch, that's right. I wouldn't mind having them come to mine. The create, again, this is that aspect of where we're trying to grow that impact course in particular and find other places where students are engaged in personalized projects. That goal is only being partially met at this point at 7%. Our goal was 10% of our graduating class to engage in a passion project with a public performance. Compete. So Compete's sort of the big one that we've been talking about with the students earning post-secondary credit or industry certification. 90% is our goal. We had 86% of our students earn that before they left, and you saw some of the statistics around that earlier. Connect is the mentoring one that's been mentioned a couple times tonight, and so 53% of our graduating seniors had an industry-based mentor, and we find that to be an incredibly valuable process. I think I've mentioned to you before that, you know, a parent can say something, a teacher can say something to a high school kid, but for some reason when that mentor says it to them, it's much more profound to them, and so we see just really rich experiences through that process. Commit is about students' goal setting. The commit and care both, again, are about the goal setting for their wellness as well as goals down the graduate profile road where students are saying, here's what I want to accomplish this year. They do this through their homeroom process. They engage in it as a mid-year, a start of the year process, a mid-year process, an end of year process. And we wanted 100% of our 9th and 10th grade students to be able to complete that. We were at 91% that did engage in that ACP conference at the end of the year, and a similar number for care. We wanted all of our 9th and 10th grade students. We actually had some juniors that participated in that, so we ended up with 58% of all students. So it was not quite all of our 9th, 10th graders, but we included juniors in there, so a little more than half our students engaged in that process of wellness tracking throughout last year. A couple of highlights I just wanted to point out. Jean Bjork actually earned the Wisconsin Art Teacher of the Year Award from the Wisconsin Art Education Association, so that's quite a impressive award. To even go further a little bit, there's actually an elementary art teacher award, and there's a secondary art teacher award, and there's sort of those specific ones. She was the overall art teacher of the year for the state of Wisconsin, so that was pretty impressive. And as I think you guys might be familiar, we won a few things last year when it came to athletics, football, basketball, a number of different state appearances. Track sent, I think, a record number of kids to state, and so our students certainly are meeting the compete category on the athletics component of things. So in working in partnership with Mr. Pizzo, some of the things that we've been doing that are similar would be around the idea of providing some clarity regarding maximizing instructional time. So not only bringing ACT skills specifically to the forefront, but also utilizing our time within our classrooms through bell work, through closure activities, and really trying to capitalize on every minute that we have with the students. We've also set some building-wide expectations about behavior. And so the students might be willing to tell you a little bit about the fact that we maybe don't allow or we're not quite as flexible around cell phone use throughout the day. So we want to try and make sure, you see plenty of signs around here that indicate this is a phone-free zone. This is any learning space that we have. We're trying to be really consistent about that. Again, trying to maximize on the time that we have with the kids during the day. And then also some professional expectations that we gave to our teachers. And then that ACT piece that Danielle spoke about earlier, I can certainly talk further about that, but ultimately that is something that is going to be, first and foremost, something that we're really pushing this year to make sure that we are hitting those skills and differentiating for different students within our classes.
Thank you, Brian. Questions for Brian and for PHS? Dylan Wasabi, you want to weigh in on the phone rules, or?
Yeah.
You're right. There's no phone usage. It's just if you want to play music, you put it on, not during instructional time, then you just put it away. They've been saying push play and put it away is what we should be doing, and that's what I've been seeing people doing.
Yeah, Mrs. Price actually came up with that phrase because a lot of what we would see is kids always having to pull out and like, oh, I gotta go find another song. We're like, create a playlist, start it, put it away, and then leave it that way. If you want to listen to music, great. Like, I don't mind having some background noise on when I'm doing work, but ultimately it can't be a distraction where you're having to constantly access it. And plus, we know that's not what the kids, not what all kids are doing, and they're re-accessing their phone. So we want to try and be more efficient. Musab, did you have any thoughts as a junior last year, and some of the things that maybe you witnessed with perspectives about the ACT?
Yeah, I think just the attitude towards ACT, I didn't see too much of like a shift because of colleges going to test optional, but I did see like a little bit more of like less preparation, or people realizing that they would be able to fall back on the opportunity to apply test optional. So I think that could have been a reason why people maybe were a little bit more relaxed, didn't have as much pressure maybe to perform well, which could have been a reason, but I don't know if that was the biggest reason for lower scores, but it's definitely something that played a factor.
Thanks, Musab. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Larry?
Brian, could you just go back for a second in terms of the thing you started out with at the beginning where you talked about your own student asking about whether you could block YouTube? Talk to me a little bit more about that and how did that come about, and were you able to do it relatively quickly and easily, or?
Oh, you mean just as a parent?
Well, however it came to you, I guess.
Sure. Can I plug a company on here? I mean, through my cell phone provider, there is a family plan, and so you have the ability to monitor where students are going, what they're doing, how much time, my son and daughter, what they're doing on their phones. So it kind of just it tracks all that, and then you can set filters to say this is okay, this is not okay. The thing that I did that sort of mirrored the wellness tracker is that there was a graph that would show throughout the day when you were spending time on your phone and how much time you were spending. And so whenever I was concerned about it, I just provided the graph. Like, look at how much time was used, and spent on this yesterday. And so when we talk about I don't have enough time to do homework or chores or whatever it might be, it's like, well, here's a lot of time that's being spent. What might you do differently with it? And so just not giving directives, but giving data, and then letting him be reflective. And so this is something that he did today that kind of fit with that.
So you were giving them the feedback, or giving him or her the feedback via the data.
Right.
And then it was them self-reflecting on it and saying, here I am spending the 2 hours or 3 hours a day or something on it, and it's not necessarily the best use of my time. Is that the self-learning that kind of comes out of this then?
Well, that's really what we want to do with the wellness tracker, because we're not having, from a privacy standpoint, we don't actually have them give us the data.
Right.
All I do is I go around and I just make sure that I can see that they've submitted the form and that they've collected the data. Then they do a reflection on it, and they do provide us the reflection on their data, but ultimately it's theirs. We want the students to do this, to see, here's how much time I'm on a screen, here's how much time I'm getting sleeping. I have a student in my homeroom who told me that he usually goes to bed at 12:30 at night on a school night. And I was like, well, how are you possibly getting enough sleep for that? And he's like, I'm not. And I was like, okay, well, what should we do about that? And so really just getting them to reflect on their own habits and what they could do to try and improve themselves is, data's powerful if you can see those trends.
So do you offer a course for that to parents so they can work with their kids like that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really the nice thing about our ACP conferences at the end of the year, where the students were sharing that information with their parents, and the parents did find that valuable. That was some consistent feedback that we received from them. You know, here's what my data is, and they could see that, you know, with their kids and have those types of conversations. So, trust me, I don't have everything figured out from a parenting standpoint.
No, but I think it's really reflective. And I think it's one of those things where sometimes we don't necessarily know that some of these tools are available to us because, again, it could potentially be real valuable. I mean, if like I'm into a Google searching on stuff, I can spend hours doing Google search, or I'm kind of into ancestry type things. I spend hours on it, and it's like, well, where did that time go?
Right.
Not necessarily the best use of my time, but I find it fascinating. It's like, okay, well, I just wasted 4 or 5 hours because I really didn't find anything anyhow. So when I do that, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have spent as much time or realized that it wasn't there. And it happens in my work setting too, where I do some work in supporting our clinicians that use our computer system. And it's the same thing. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you spending this much time going through this? And you can't get your notes done. You can't sign off on things. You don't sign orders. And it's like, what is happening here? So it's somehow to teach and reflect that in the sense that these tools that we've created from technology standpoint, they can work for you or they can work against you. And that's the hard part, is like, we've now made the world available for some of us in the room. I mean, if you wanted to go look something up, you had to go to your local library, and maybe if you were lucky enough, you had an encyclopedia somewhere to look it up. But now the whole world is out there for things to be looked up, if you will, and you can go deeper and dig into the holes and keep going and going and going with it. So anyway, my point is maybe you ought to go down and record this as a milestone in history that you had a student or your son, put it on a calendar somewhere and say, on this date in 2022, you realized, or here's a monumental point where that self-realization of the utilization of time will affect the rest of your life and your career. You realize that, now I were able to do something about it, and you made a life change that maybe made a big difference in his rest of his life, if you will, out there. And I'm obviously pontificating and going more than that, but I think that's significant. I mean, it's a significant self-reflection and self-learning from that. So.
And ultimately, we just want to create those learning experiences to give students the opportunity and open the door to them. I'm not trying to be cliche there, but open the door to them recognizing and being able to be in control of their own learning, their own time, their own health, their own mental status, all of that.
So I also understand that apparently you're a graduate of Monroe High School, and you're going to be, the Pewaukee team will be playing in Monroe this weekend?
There is a rematch happening on Friday, yes.
Okay. Are there going to be fan buses going down there by any chance? Or
The fan bus was advertised this afternoon, yes. I am not. That's 4 hours of driving. That's a long ways.
Oh, you're not driving the bus?
I'm not driving the bus, no.
Oh, well, you could do it, you know.
I have family still in Monroe, so I'll be staying overnight, and I don't think everybody else is going to stay. 65 kids are going to stay at my parents' house this Friday night.
Tell Julie that I want to know about the fan bus then, though, so.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you very much for it. That's a really good reflection, though, and I think, obviously, you kind of had the nice summary with it in terms of the graduate profile. And Danielle knows this as well. I mean, that's something that we wanted to do as a board, is to kind of take some of this stuff that we're seeing from early on to high school graduates. How do we, as adults or board members or leaders, kind of put together our profile of what it is that we think is successful? So, and a couple of them, I mean, when you talk about the mentors, it's like from a career standpoint, having a mentor, not having a mentor makes a huge difference in any career or profession that's out there. And you can talk to a lot of people about that. That's what makes people successful, is having really good mentors at the stage where you're at in your life or your career. So,
and that's actually what the goal is developing a professional learning network already as you are leaving here. And it starts with us connecting you with a mentor, but you have, the kids have other ways of making some of those connections already prior to them leaving here. We all have our learning networks and the people that we rely on to get advice from, to kick around ideas with, that sort of thing. And we want the kids to be ready with that when they leave here and see the value in it.
Any other questions for Brian?
Just wanted to mention, you had talked about implementing more ACT stuff this year, and I just wanted to mention I have seen some of that. I know in my physics course and my calc course, we have done multiple ACT practices after work time or after tests. So it's just nice to see that some of those changes are actually coming into effect, and hopefully come March or whenever the ACT happens, that sort of improvement in that ACT score for the school.
Awesome, thank you. Have you been going into Methodize into?
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's the ACT prep course too, and that's been helpful. And then, you know, my brother, he's been convincing me to study more and more for that. So.
Perfect. Good. Yeah, so we've been utilizing an online test program, a test practice program through our ACT prep course, but we're trying to weave it into our other classes as well. So far this year, the Pewaukee High School students have answered 65,581 practice test questions by the end of October here. So it's getting utilized is the idea.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, just to summarize then, so here's the takeaway. If you've just heard a boatload of stuff, right?
I want John to go just as long as I did
Yeah,
tonight.
nobody
These
wants
next
that,
two new
Danielle.
business items, come on,
Nobody
let's
wants
see if
that,
we can do
Danielle.
it.
But so the takeaway for me is this. I mean, it's a lot to digest for anybody watching, but you know, I hope the takeaway is that it's clear that we look at our data, that we set challenging goals, that we create intentional plans designed to generate improvement, and hopefully that was clear in the presentation tonight. You know, there's things that we talked about tonight that you should have reflected, things maybe you heard of during strategic planning. One of the things that I remember coming out was screen time. We heard things about screen time. We heard things about mental health and wellness for students. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about some of the behavior challenges we had last year. You heard a lot about behavior, about expectations, about approaches, about supports being put in place there. You know, you can see curriculums that you've approved, and you can see some results from those curriculums. You can see maybe some growth in social studies and mathematics in terms of some of the things that we've chosen to invest in. So, you know, that's my hope, is that these kinds of presentations, it's a lot, but the patterns and themes that you see more than remembering any specific data point is that it's about the approach. The approach is to analyze and study what it is that we do, create plans, try to get better at it, then go back to looking at how we did, make adjustments, refine our plans, and continue to try to get better, and that's what this is. That's what this was for. So I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, for the time that you put in, and as well as Candace and Danielle for your report.
Thank you. All right, John. Have a nice night, everyone.
Thank you. You don't want to stick around for budget?
All right, thanks, Stacy. So tonight, is one of the benchmark steps along the way of the budget development process and the budget development calendar for the district. So for the fiscal year 22-23, the preliminary operating budget is developed in January, February, March of 2022. That budget is pulled together and presented to the board in April and then adopted. That gives us our preliminary spending plan to allow us to get the year started and do our hiring to implement some of the things that we're looking at engaging in. There's three key pieces of data that need to be projected at that time. One is the third Friday in September count of pupils, the pupil membership count. The second one is to have the value for the property within the district, the valuation within the district. And the third one is the largest one, which happens on October 14th, is the certification of equalization aid for the year for the district. All three of those combine to feed our revenue limit for the district for the year. Revenue limit is that state aid and general aid and property taxes. So the result of having that aid certified and the limit calculated is to determine what the property tax levy is, which will be the second item of business we'll look at tonight. So the first focus is on that budget. We refer to this as the original budget for the district. From a financial reporting standpoint, in our financial statements, you'll have your original budget compared to what your final expenditures are. So this becomes our original because we finally have the data that we need to calculate what those limits are and the budget's going to be. Total revenues in the general fund, and we focus mainly on the general fund here. Total revenues increase of just over $450,000. The largest portion of that came in the form of, from the governor's office, the Get Kids Ahead initiative that was just announced in August, right before school started.
It was another one of the federal resources then that's passed through to districts. That was about $249,000. We also are recognizing some additional revenue from open enrollment students. We have about 10 students more stay. Open enrollment is, you're predicting every year what your attrition is going to be. What's your turnover? Do students decide not to open enroll anymore? Do some of them move into the district and become residents? So we had a swing, an increase of about 10 from what we projected in the budget there, generating just over $100,000 of additional revenue. And then finally, interest rates with where they are right now compared to back in March, we're anticipating that we're going to earn a little bit more on that, so that increased our revenues also. On the expenditure side, a couple of things that are impacting us. Number one, modifications in that staffing plan to address some specific student needs as they've either moved into the districts or their need has changed, which then we brought on more staff. We had to bring on additional staff to address those needs. We also have chargebacks of taxes where we have to, if taxes are rescinded or recalculated for an entity, we have to pay that back to the village the following year. So that number was a lot higher at about $75,000 than what we typically would see in a district, in the district here. Even with those changes, the revenues that we're looking at in the general fund represent about a 1.6% increase over the revenues we had last year. One of the largest portions of our revenues in the budget this year is utilizing those federal resources from the ARPA funding to be able to cover those operating costs, those recurring costs that are increasing from last year. That total use of federal funds represents about $1.4 million that we're projecting for this year. So any questions from a budget standpoint?
Appreciate how you lay it out.
It's pretty typical that we'll make some adjustments at this point of the year because again, we're 7 months removed from from defining this. One of the big things that impacts us from a budget standpoint, and this will be the final year of it, is a declining enrollment exemption. So when COVID hit, we dropped in enrollment of just about 100 students. In the second year, a little bit less, about 18 students in membership. It's a 3-year rolling average, so it takes you time to climb back out of that as your enrollment recovers. Next year, we should not have that declining enrollment adjustment anymore. The downside of that is it adds to your revenue limit to allow you to maintain. It softens the impact of declining because of the 3-year average, but when you climb out, it's not recurring. It drops out of your base, so you don't have that in your base revenue for the following year. So that's where the revenue limit gets really tight as you climb out of that declining enrollment. And we're in that situation right now. So as we move forward, hence the 1.6% change in overall revenues in the district. This year we do have a decrease in an equalization aid. It calculated out to about 14.5%. It was a year that we were predicting about a 15% decrease, so it's just as expected within that. Second item then I'll touch on is the property tax levy. The levy, and here's where it gets a little confusing in the memo that I gave you because we like to compare how accurate were we on the preliminary budget to the final one, but we also compare to what did we have last year compared to this year. So what was it from 21-22 to 22-23? So I'm going to focus on the change year over year rather than from the preliminary. So year over year change, we're looking at a decrease in the property tax levy of about 0.93% from the levy last year. This year we're at $28,004,458. It is up slightly a little bit from the preliminary budget, about $44,000, but that's a function of having a couple fewer kids than what we predicted, which resulted in in the declining enrollment exemption shrinking and the hold harmless exemption shrinking and driving that slight increase. From the revenue limit standpoint, we see some increases in there due to some of the voucher students and the levies that are associated with that. We had an increase in the levy for special needs scholarship program where students go to private schools. The board has the authority through that exemption in the revenue limit to levy the amount of money that we have to pay for those students. Final adjustment from the preliminary to the final budget is the inclusion of a community service fund in here. As we look at a community resource officer with the village for the second half of the school year, and to cover summer school, the summertime, both morning and afternoon. So available in the community, available on the campus here, but having a second officer included in there fits the definition of this community service, this Fund 80, which is outside of the revenue limit from a levy standpoint. Much like Fund 39, debt service is outside of the revenue limit once it's referendum approved.
I want to thank you guys for that creativity and coming up with that idea to add a second officer and getting it done so quickly.
Thank you.
We'll go into some detail on the different exemptions, but I won't do that here. There's about 5 or 6
Danielle
different
would like you
exemptions.
to go line by line, please.
Yes.
She was hoping for some reason.
Yes.
Have you been having trouble sleeping lately, Danielle?
I think she's gonna sleep well tonight.
A little bit more on the equalization aid and the history of that. We'll be looking at that, the way that our structure is on our aid right now. We'll see a decrease of aid of about 15% every other year. In the year in between, we'll recover that. So it kind of spikes up and down and levels out. This is a year where we anticipated losing the 15. Next year, we'll anticipate gaining in equalization aid again. Tax base. So equalization aid is based partially on the value you have per pupil within your district. Statewide, the value for property was up over 14.5% on average. We went up about 8.6% this year, so we lagged the state. You would think that would be a bad thing, but when it comes to equalization aid, we have lower growth than the state average. So it increases our equalization aid because our property value is growing per pupil at a rate slower than what the rest of the state is. So a greater proportion of that equalization aid pot goes to our district. We'll see that for 23-24. So that is actually a help for next year. With the rest of the funds in the district, we're levying in Fund 39 just over $5 million. That'll be for the debt service payments that are due within the next 12 months, plus what we look to defease at the end of the fiscal year or into next fiscal year for debt service payments. The Capital Projects Fund, Fund 41, at the annual meeting we had proposed and was approved a levy of $10,000 to just continue the contribution to that capital improvement fund. We talked about Fund 80, and the net effect is about a $44,000 change from the preliminary budget that was at the annual meeting for the district. Overall, $262,000 decrease in the levy from 2021-22 to 22-23. About 0.92, 0.93%. Any questions on the levy?
I have a question about funds.
Yep.
So like the 80 fund and the 39 fund, you put $10,000 into that. Are there certain limits to what you can put in there? I mean,
No.
so, instead of 80,000 in the 80 fund, we put $70,000, we got to put $700,000?
Yeah, I mean, you levy, and it should be your operating costs for that community service for the following year.
So you do have to connect it to an activity?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's just like the general fund. If you accumulate too large of a fund balance in there, that can be problematic because you're beyond the uses that you have for it.
But it's a little hard to find that for 39 fund.
Right, Fund 39 and 80 are both restricted. Fund 39 has to be used for debt service. It cannot be, once it's levied for there, you can't use it for any other purpose, for principal and interest on outstanding debt. So if you pay off all your debt early, you have to utilize that balance as long as you have debt outstanding.
But if you wanted to pay your debts off earlier, you could really fill that bucket up.
You could.
Okay.
You could. And then there's a timing issue that gets into a whole other standard
I
on
get
on that.
Right.
So yes, those 39 and 80 are outside of the revenue limit. They are restricted, but by different parameters, and they're restricted to be used only for the purpose that you have for them.
All right, any other questions?
That's true.
Of course.
Finally, the tax rate for the year, and the tax rate at the preliminary, at the annual meeting, we had projected a reduction from $8.91 down to $8.49. The actual comes out to $8.09, because that property value grew so much faster than what we had predicted in the preliminary budget, growing almost 9%, versus about 4% that we had predicted.
Are we ready for a motion?
I think so.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the revised original budget for the 2022-2023 school year as presented, and include a copy of the attached budget summary in the official meeting minutes.
Second.
All right, we have a motion to approve the amended or revised original budget. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Ryan, do you want to take the next one too, please?
Sure. I make a motion to approve a tax levy of $28,004,458 for all funds for the 2022-2023 school year.
Second.
All right, motion to approve the tax levy. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
John.
John, good job. Great work. That was shorter.
Just a little. All right. Jeannie, moving on to the policy.
We should point out that it doesn't always happen that way.
The budget stuff doesn't always go as
Well,
quickly as
John, being shorter than
Yeah.
general.
Thank you, John.
Yay, John. Start out with 7100.02, committee appointments. We had a question on this as to whether we could have more than a quorum on a committee meeting. And we sent it past the attorneys, and they said as long as we have the line in there that says that these committees are not legislative and cannot make commitments for the full board, we are okay with having more than a quorum on a committee meeting.
Good, okay.
So there were no changes with
So
that
there were
one.
no changes on that one. That's kind of the reason it got brought forward. 8000.02, community relations, public participation in board meetings. We wanted to set this up so that basically it was people who had skin in the game that could comment. So it could be residents, parents of enrolled students, or staff. They're affiliated with our school and not outside sources.
I like this change a lot. Thank you for doing that.
Brian, does that answer your question, kind of?
Yeah, I still have an issue with, anybody who's part of the community gets to speak, but just because they're employed here and may not be part of the community, I don't think we really need to get comments from them. And employees in and of themselves have a process. They can go to their supervisor, the building principal, or the superintendent. I don't know that if they came to us here, we wouldn't just turn around and have them go back through the process. Or, if they do have some comments to make about how we run our schools and are not part of the community, I'm not sure that we really need to hear from them. We're here to represent our community members, not members of other communities.
A partial response, I think, Brian, to that, just a reaction. I think that we wanted to try to be as open and transparent as we could for those opportunities, but yes, we are restricting it to, people who generally live in the community, but a stakeholder, and I think maybe that's a better way to state it. A parent, guardian, a student, staff member, they're a stakeholder in the organization, but that's just my thought.
Well, if you're gonna take that logic forward, then you need to invite parents of open enrolled kids.
We do.
Oh,
We
yeah,
do.
absolutely, yeah, parent, yeah.
That's in there.
Right, they're automatically included, so.
Yeah,
Parent or guardian.
because that was the statement, to clarify, the intention of enrolled Hear the viewpoints of district residents, staff, enrolled students, and parents, guardians of Pewaukee School District enrolled students, Brian. So that was meant to include open enrollment.
So that's the catch
Kids.
that wasn't there before? We're adding those?
Though that, yeah, so if you go to the one that's, because there's two in there, if you go to the first reading, you can see the red.
It used to just say citizens.
It just, you say
It used to say
citizens throughout the
citizens.
district, so the change there is viewpoints of instead of citizens throughout the district. It was of district residents, staff, enrolled students, and parents and guardians of Pewaukee School District enrolled students was the change that's proposed.
At the meeting that we had with the WASB, the pre-meeting workshop, I mean, we talked a little bit about he talked about groups coming in and how to structure the language of that policy or that type of a policy where you didn't want to have people truly coming in from outside of your community. Again, it could be, as he referred to it, the people coming over from Madison or someplace else that have no direct connection to the community or district, residents of the district in any way, shape, or form, so.
I don't understand your point.
Well, the fact that you couldn't have just groups coming in here, having a particular discussion point or perspective that they want to present to the Pewaukee School Board if they don't have some connection with the school district. So, however, it's, student, parent, guardian, enrolled students, et cetera, so. You just can't have somebody come over from Madison and give us
So people that don't live here but are employed by that
employed would,
happenstance get to,
well, if they're employed here, they're a stakeholder here,
people that are employed here have different processes to give us feedback.
they do too, but.
All right, well, I disagree with the change, but I can see where there's flowing.
Okay.
Anyone else have any more comments? Okay, 6400.09, which is programs for children at risk. And Danielle put this forward, and basically this all comes from the state, correct, your wording?
It goes to match our wording that we have for our accelerated students or gifted and talented students, and so it's just mirroring that language from that other policy.
Yeah, and both of those refer to the handbook.
Yeah,
right?
the RTI
The RTI
handbook.
handbook,
Mhm.
yeah.
Any questions on that one? Okay. 6400.01 then was standardized testing. And we just made a few minor changes in this one to make it a little more concise. Some changes like second language ESL has now been changed to learner EL. It's just the new changes in vocabulary. And Larry liked the fact that down at the bottom when we talked about the superintendent or his designee, we attached a policy number with it so you could tell exactly where it went. Okay. Computer's not letting me go to the next one. Computer problems, guys, here.
No problem.
6400, okay. Standardized testing, so we're on 6600.02, assessment of student achievement. I received no questions on that particular one either. Yes.
Yeah, and that one was largely just some terminology
Just some
changes.
terminology.
Yeah.
And then we had 6700.01. We made curriculum, we made no changes on that one, correct, Danielle? Yes.
6400.12 curriculum, no
Okay.
changes.
No changes, that's the one on assessment of student achievement, and we had gone through and made all those changes about a year ago when the social studies curriculum came up. And then we have 67.01 graduation requirements. This one, they made some changes Danielle, you might want to.
Yeah, so this
Yeah.
one really was, we have a policy on high school grading procedures, and that one's gonna be coming up, I think in December is when that one is due to come up. So we actually just took some of the language from that one and put it in here specific to the civics graduation requirement and the number of classes for that free period option for juniors and seniors, because those are really graduation requirements and not a grading procedure, so it was weird that they were in that other policy. And then we are suggesting changing the electives to just 12.5 overall electives versus 9.5, and then 3 specific to our fine arts or CTE programming. This benefits all students in having the flexibility, but primarily our students, our highest achieving students, are students who sometimes don't always hit that 3 mark for CTE or fine arts. We've had 2 students in particular in the last couple of years that both of which were valedictorian or salutatorians, that would not have hit that 3, and we had to make an exception for. So this just gives us more flexibility with that. You know, the vast majority of students end up taking more than enough credits in those specific programs. And so just wanted to get that kind of cleaned up.
The other thing we said is if we put it in additional electives, it would be easier to slot some of the credits that the students are now getting through dual enrollment in there too. Okay.
I think you have
One more, 70, the computer refreshed, I guess. 7100.11, Board of Education evaluation process. Where did we end up on that one?
Were there no changes, I think, in that one, Jean?
This is a first draft, but please note that we are still going to come up with procedures to go with it. We have not written those yet. But this is kind of what we are looking at for doing our evaluations and how often we need to do them. And we didn't want to get real specific about a time and a date, but we can always put those into the procedures. So if any of you have any suggestions as to what you would like in the procedures in particular, we would certainly welcome them.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? All right, thank you, Jeannie.
Okay, thank you.
Personnel issues?
No resignations, no employments, no leaves.
All right. Board goals and operations, review of upcoming activities. So, the next time we will be together is next Thursday, November 3rd at 6 o'clock, for the expulsion hearing in the district office conference room.
Stacy, I won't be making that one.
Okay,
Yeah,
It's
we have,
expulsion hearing, right?
we
yep,
have,
that
We have
one,
enough?
we have 4.
Okay,
yep,
so I'm not the
4
only one.
people, we have 4.
I'm not the only one being,
No, only 4 could make it.
okay.
And the other date that we looked at, only 3 could make it, so 4 gives us a quorum, so we're okay.
And then, if you could look online, Julie has the interview schedule. Right now, we're looking at 2 on Monday, November 7th, and 2 on Thursday, November 10th. So, as Julie does, she will monitor that and consolidate to one night if she can. We'll get that all figured out, but that's a live document that we can follow, right, Julie? Correct. That you shared with us, yeah. Okay. And then Monday, November 14th is our next board meeting. And we have business affairs at 6, the regular at 7, and then Monday, November 28th is our next regular meeting.
Can I just note that I won't be here on November 14th. I will be having new courses come forward. Mike will be able to present all of it, and Brian Sniff can answer questions as well as needed. But if you do have questions prior to that, if you could just send them to me over the weekend. I'll be at an aviation conference out of town with Adriana on our aviation course and making some contacts. So excited for that opportunity. Yeah.
Is that another school district you're going to? Is that?
We're going to Memphis for the National AOPA Conference, which is the one that is the resource that we're using and stuff, so, yeah.
All
And then they're just gonna fly their own plane home.
Yes, right, there you go.
And they're gonna be getting some hours in the simulator before they go.
Is that is a company sponsoring that, or is
The curriculum resource that we use, the AOPA, can't come up with what it
American
stands
Pilots
for.
Association or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, something Pilots Association, is hosting it, so it's a lot of NASA astronauts and, commercial pilots and just a ton of people that we'll be able to both hear from, connect with, build relationships with, and also the company that is providing our resource for us will be able to build that as well. So the lineup just looks fantastic.
Nice.
Super excited.
All right, then Monday, December 5th, we have our learning session. Mark Olson is going to be there. Alana Leffler, is it? She
Yeah.
works with him.
Yeah, Mark and Alana are the two
Okay.
attorneys we work with.
Our first December meeting will be on the 12th. Then we don't meet until the 9th of January. And then hopefully you all were able to respond to Julie about the change on meeting for our next learning session on the 30th rather than the 23rd. Hopefully everybody was able to get back to Julie on that.
Yeah, that's when it fit Melissa's schedule.
Okay. Anything as far as a legislative update?
There's a big vote coming up in a couple of weeks. I think that's what it's all about right now in terms of legislative action. John and I have had some conversations about doing some engagement, reaching out to Senator Kepinger and Representative Nalen. We decided it would probably make the most sense to wait until after the election because that'll set some direction. And then we think those discussions would be more fruitful, after knowing what the results of the election are.
Sounds good. And then finally, to have a discussion about the NSBA conference in attendance. So I know, Brian, you are not able to attend,
No, I thought I'd celebrate my anniversary for a change.
and Jane, you don't think you're gonna be able to attend? You might wanna try and do virtual? I mean, it's up to you, I'm not,
Yeah.
It's tax season, right?
yeah, so that might not even be an option, totally get it.
No, and not that week
Okay.
either, yeah.
All right.
I would
Jeannie,
like to go, Stacy.
you'd like to go? Larry, you'd like to go? I think Bren would like to go.
I think she
Okay.
also discussed, she's one that discussed, virtual.
Oh, she was?
Yeah, she did, she mentioned it. I
You
don't
mentioned
know.
it.
Oh, I
Yeah,
thought
she
she was tying it to a trip.
She's torn. I
Oh.
think if she can't go, then, yeah, I think she was trying to tie it to a trip, but then also interested in the virtual.
Okay,
So either way, I think hers was yes.
okay, it's yes, it's just a matter of whether she'll be going down or going virtual. Gotcha, thank you. Okay.
One
Any,
thing to add, for the NSBA presentation, or the presentation on that, I'm interested in doing, co-presenting with Danielle, the school, starting post-secondary success while in high school, if available, so.
Danielle, I will present wherever you need me.
Yeah, at NSBA, we just have the one, the post-secondary success. At WASB, we have two.
Okay.
We have measuring the graduate profile and post-secondary success,
I
so.
volunteered on the graduate profile one.
Okay. Yeah, probably, late November, early December, we'll set up some times with the groups to
Okay.
go over draft presentations.
right,
Yeah,
we have two at
WASB.
WASB.
What's that?
We have two sessions at WASB.
Wednesday and Friday.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, and then Julie, they just work through you for flights or do it on their own situation?
Well,
right?
through Julie, if it's Southwest, right, Julie?
Yeah.
Yeah,
if
because
it's-
we have that large, that was from the band or the choir trip reimbursement to New York City that we have capacity on that yet to utilize.
Okay.
Because, yeah, for Southwest, you can get direct to Orlando. Direct flights are good.
Direct flights are good.
Maybe, and Danielle will have her pilot flight license. But
Yeah.
I'll
she
be
can
coming from
co-pilot.
Pensacola because we'll be on spring break with my family and stuff, which oddly, there are very few, if not no, direct flights from Pensacola to Orlando. And it takes approximately 9 hours on a flight, which it takes 8 hours to
But so
drive.
you can drive it in 7.5.
Yeah, so I'm gonna keep watching the flights and see what I can't find. It's a little-
Meet a private pilot at that conference
Right.
you're going to, see
Yeah.
how much he would charge you.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
son maybe will have his temps pilot's like he's in the aviation class. Maybe he'll. Yeah,
All right, Carter.
I
Just
trust him to
started
drive
just
a car right
just
now. I don't
started
think we're
driving a
at
car. Now
yeah.
he's gonna jump right
I
to
don't think we're at
planes.
plane level just yet.
Can we update the succession plan?
Yeah, we just did.
Especially if you ever get in that airplane with him.
Yeah.
All right. No one's in the building, so I'm assuming we have no comments from citizens, so I'm just left with adjournment. We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.